The Ulaner system had become a festering wound in the Imperium's eastern fringe, a concentration of greenskin power unlike anything witnessed since humanity first reached for the stars. The Orc Empire sprawled across hundreds of worlds, its warlords commanding billions of warriors under the banner of Erlak-Erg, a beast of such monstrous size and cunning that his Waath threatened to engulf entire sectors. Imperial expeditionary fleets had broken against Ulaner's outlying systems like waves against bedrock, each assault revealing the true scale of the threat. The Greenskins had fortified their holdings with a sophistication that defied their brutish reputation, constructing vast orbital defense networks and planet-side fortresses that could withstand sustained bombardment from capital ships. The Emperor of Mankind made a decision that sent ripples through the highest echelons of Imperial command. He would personally lead the final campaign, bringing with him the full might of multiple Space Marine legions in a concentration of force that had rarely been assembled even during the Great Crusade's most desperate hours. The Luna Wolves, Blood Angels, White Scars, Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, Death Guard, and Emperor's Children all received orders to converge on the Ulaner system, their Primarchs summoned to wage war alongside their creator. This was not merely another compliance action or xenocide operation. The Emperor intended Ulaner to serve as a demonstration of Imperial supremacy, a statement that no Xenos empire, regardless of its strength, could stand before humanity's manifest destiny. Horus Lupercal commanded the Luna Wolves with the absolute confidence of a warrior who had never known defeat. His legion had earned its reputation through 2 centuries of brutal warfare, specializing in the lightning-fast decapitation strikes that had become their hallmark. Where other legions ground down resistance through attrition or overwhelming firepower, the Luna Wolves struck at the enemy's nerve centers with surgical precision. Horus understood that the Orcs, despite their apparent lack of sophistication, operated within a rigid hierarchy where strength determined authority. Kill the strongest warboss, and his subordinates would turn on each other in a frenzy of dominance challenges that could shatter entire armies. The Ulaner campaign began with a series of coordinated assaults across the system's outer worlds. The White Scars, led by Jagatai Khan, swept through the void on rapid strike cruisers, their hit-and-run tactics disrupting Orc supply lines and communication networks. Rogel Dorn's Imperial Fists established beachheads with methodical efficiency, constructing forward operating bases that could withstand anything the Greenskins threw against them. Fulgrim's Emperor's Children fought with a precision that bordered on artistic, each bolter round and chainsword strike executed with perfect economy of motion. Yet it was Horus who orchestrated the broader strategy, coordinating these disparate forces into a coherent whole that exploited every weakness in the Orc defenses. The assault on Ulaner Prime itself required a level of inter-legion cooperation that tested even the Primarch's abilities to work in concert. Horus established a command structure that respected each legion's strengths while maintaining unified strategic objectives. He positioned the Death Guard, under Mortarian's stoic leadership, to weather the inevitable Orc counterattacks, their legendary resilience turning them into unbreakable anvils against which the Greenskin hordes shattered. Sanguinius and the Blood Angels provided rapid response capabilities, their jump pack assaults striking wherever the line threatened to break. Robute Guilliman's Ultramarines, the largest of the legions present, formed the campaign's backbone, their tactical flexibility allowing them to adapt to the chaotic flow of battle against an enemy that fought with more enthusiasm than sense. The Greenskins defended their throne world with a ferocity that impressed even the Space Marines. Orc Gargant's towering war machines that dwarfed Imperial Titans strode across battlefields churning with millions of combatants. Stormboys descended from the smoke-choked skies in screaming waves, their crude rocket packs trailing fire and black exhaust. Battle wagons plowed through Imperial lines, their crews bellowing war cries in the guttural Orc tongue, while firing every weapon they could bolt onto their vehicles. The planetary capital, a sprawling fortress city called Rust Ridge, had been transformed into a killing ground where every street and structure concealed ambush points and murder holes. Horus led the final assault on Erlak-Erg's palace personally, fighting at the head of his Justaran Terminators through corridors wide enough to accommodate the Orc warlord's massive frame. The palace interior reeked of fungal growth and promethium, its walls decorated with the crude glyphs that passed for orc art. Resistance intensified as the Luna Wolves pushed deeper, encountering the warlord's personal guard, massive brutes clad in thick plates of scavenged armor and wielding power claws that could shear through ceramite. Horus moved through the melee with the fluid grace of a born warrior, his lightning claws worldbreaker crackling with energy as they carved through greenskin flesh. His tactical genius extended even to close combat, reading the flow of battle and positioning his warriors to maximize their effectiveness in the confined spaces. The confrontation between Horus and Erlak-Erg became the stuff of immediate legend. The orc warlord stood nearly twice the height of a normal greenskin, his body a mass of scar tissue and crude bionics that whirred and hissed with each movement. He wielded a power claw the size of a rhino transport and wore armor plates torn from destroyed Imperial tanks. The duel lasted mere minutes, but those who witnessed it spoke of Horus's absolute mastery of combat. He did not simply overpower the warlord through superior strength or equipment. Instead, he dismantled Erlak-Erg with calculated strikes that exploited every gap in the creature's defenses, every momentary overextension, every predictable attack pattern. When Horus finally drove his claws through the warlord's throat, severing the beast's head from its shoulders, the psychic shockwave of the leader's death rippled through the entire Orc Empire. The Emperor himself had watched the final assault from his command post, surrounded by his custodian guard and the most senior Imperial commanders. When Horus emerged from the palace, covered in Xeno's blood and carrying Erlak-Erg's head, the Emperor's approval was evident even through his carefully maintained composure. The Ulaner campaign had demonstrated not just Horus's martial prowess, but his ability to command forces on a scale that few could manage. He had coordinated 7 legions, each with its own culture and combat doctrine, into a unified force that had crushed the greatest orc empire in the galaxy. The triumph that followed the campaign's conclusion brought together the largest gathering of Imperial forces since the Great Crusade's inception. The Emperor ordered the construction of a massive amphitheater on Ulaner's surface, built from the ruins of orc fortifications and capable of holding hundreds of thousands of warriors. Space Marines from every legion present stood in perfect formation, their armor cleaned and repaired, their banners displaying the honors earned through 2 centuries of warfare. Imperial army regiments filled the outer tiers, their officers wearing full-dress uniforms despite the planet's oppressive heat. Mechanicum Forge Masters attended with contingents of Skitarii, their augmetic enhancements gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The Emperor ascended the amphitheater's central platform, his presence radiating authority that transcended mere physical dominance. He spoke of the Great Crusade's achievements, of the hundreds of worlds brought into compliance, of humanity's inexorable expansion across the galaxy. Then he made an announcement that shocked even those who had fought alongside him for decades. Horus Lupercal would be elevated to the rank of War Master, granted supreme command over all Space Marine legions and Imperial military forces. The title itself was unprecedented, creating a position second only to the Emperor himself in the Imperial hierarchy. Horus would speak with the Emperor's voice, his commands carrying the full weight of Imperial authority. The ceremony itself reflected the magnitude of this elevation. The Emperor removed his own laurel wreath and placed it upon Horus's head, a symbolic gesture that carried profound implications. Every Primarch present knelt before their brother, acknowledging his new authority. Even Primarchs known for their independence, like Leman Russ of the Space Wolves or Conrad Kurz of the Night Lords, bent their knees in recognition of Horus's appointment. The War Master's armor was modified to display new heraldry, the Eye of Terra prominent upon his breastplate, marking him as the Emperor's chosen instrument. Yet beneath the triumph and celebration, the Emperor delivered news that would prove far more significant than anyone present could have anticipated. He announced his intention to return to Terra, to withdraw from active command of the Great Crusade and focus on a project of vital importance to humanity's future. He provided no details about this undertaking, offering only cryptic assurances that it would secure the Imperium's long-term survival. The War Master would continue the Great Crusade, bringing the remaining human worlds into compliance and eliminating Xeno's threats wherever they arose. The Emperor's withdrawal would be permanent, his attention turned entirely to matters on Terra that he deemed too critical to delay. The Primarchs reacted to this announcement with varying degrees of concern and confusion. Some, like Guilliman, accepted the Emperor's decision with the understanding that their creator's wisdom exceeded their own comprehension. Others, particularly those Primarchs who had fought longest at the Emperor's side, struggled to process the implications of his departure. Horus himself maintained perfect composure during the ceremony, but those who knew him well noticed the subtle tension in his bearing, the brief moment of uncertainty that flickered across his features before he reasserted control. The Emperor departed Ulanor within days of the triumph, his flagship leaving the system with minimal ceremony. He took with him the bulk of the Legio Custodes and a significant portion of the Imperial administration's senior officials. The War Master found himself suddenly responsible for prosecuting a galaxy spanning military campaign without the guidance of the being who had created him and his brothers. The transition appeared seamless on the surface, with Horus immediately assuming his new duties and issuing orders that demonstrated his comprehensive understanding of the Great Crusade's strategic situation. Compliance fleets received new assignments, Legion deployments were optimized for maximum efficiency, and the pace of expansion actually increased under the War Master's direction. The question of psychers within the Space Marine Legions had festered for decades before it finally demanded resolution. What began as isolated incidents of warp-touched warriors manifesting abilities beyond normal human comprehension had evolved into formalized librarious departments across multiple legions. These warrior mystics underwent rigorous training to harness their psychic potential, channeling the Imperium's power through focused discipline and mental conditioning. The Thousand Sons had established the most sophisticated librarious program, their Primarch Magnus having devoted centuries to understanding the warp's nature. The White Scars maintained their own tradition of Stormseers, psychers who combined their abilities with the Legion's shamanistic heritage. Even legions like the Blood Angels and Space Wolves had integrated psychic warriors into their command structures, recognizing the tactical advantages such individuals provided. The proliferation of these psychic warriors generated increasing unease among several Primarchs who had witnessed firsthand the dangers of uncontrolled warp exposure. Reports filtered back to Terra describing incidents where librarians had lost control during combat, their minds breached by entities that dwelled within the Imperium. Some warriors had been consumed entirely, their bodies transformed into gateways for demonic manifestation. Others had simply burned out, their psychic abilities overwhelming their mental defenses and reducing them to catatonic husks. The threat was not theoretical or distant. It manifested on battlefields across the galaxy, creating situations where Space Marines found themselves fighting not just external enemies, but corrupted brothers whose minds had been hijacked by forces they could not comprehend. Mortarion of the Death Guard held the strongest opposition to sanctioning psychers within the legions. His experiences on Barbarus had taught him to hate witchcraft in all its forms. The overlords who had ruled his adoptive world wielded sorcerous powers drawn from the warp, using their abilities to dominate and terrorize the human populations trapped in the valleys below their poisonous fortresses. Mortarion viewed all psychers as potential tyrants, individuals whose power separated them from normal humanity and created hierarchies based on supernatural advantage rather than merit or strength. He argued that the librarious programs represented a fundamental corruption of the Space Marine ideal, introducing an element of unpredictability and vulnerability into formations that should embody absolute reliability. The Death Guard Primarch made his position clear through both official channels and private discussions with his brothers. He pointed to specific incidents where librarians had compromised military operations through loss of control or manipulation by warp entities. One particularly damning example involved a compliance action where a White Scar Stormseer had accidentally opened a rift during combat, allowing warp predators to manifest on a battlefield packed with Imperial Army regiments. The resulting casualties had been catastrophic, with thousands of soldiers dying in ways that defied conventional understanding. Mortarion insisted that no tactical advantage could justify such risks, especially when the legions had conquered hundreds of worlds without relying on psychic powers. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves approached the issue from a different perspective, but reached similar conclusions. The Wolf King distinguished between what he termed natural psychic abilities, manifestations rooted in a warrior's connection to primal forces, and sorcery, the deliberate manipulation of warp energies through ritual and study. His legion's rune priests drew their power from Fenris itself, channeling energies that Russ insisted came from the planet's spirit rather than the Imperium. This distinction struck many observers as arbitrary, but Russ defended it with absolute conviction. He viewed the systematic study of warp phenomena as inherently corrupting, an invitation for entities beyond human comprehension to infiltrate the legions through warriors who thought themselves masters of forces they barely understood. The Wolf King's opposition carried significant weight due to his reputation as one of the Emperor's most loyal sons. Russ had served as the Emperor's executioner, the Primarch tasked with eliminating threats too dangerous or too close to the throne for conventional military action. His judgment on matters of threat assessment commanded respect even from brothers who disagreed with his conclusions. When Russ declared that the Librarius programs represented an existential danger to the Imperium, other Primarchs who had remained neutral began reconsidering their positions. The Space Wolves had fought alongside nearly every legion during the Great Crusade, and Russ had observed how different forces operated under extreme conditions. His concerns about psychic corruption were not rooted in superstition or ignorance, but in direct observation of what happened when warriors delved too deeply into the warp's mysteries. Magnus the Red stood as the primary defender of sanctioned psychers and the continued operation of Librarius departments. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns had spent his entire existence studying the Imperium, developing techniques and disciplines that he believed could safely harness psychic power for humanity's benefit. Magnus argued that condemning all psychic study because of isolated incidents was equivalent to abandoning technology because some machines malfunctioned. The warp was simply another aspect of reality, one that required understanding and mastery rather than fearful rejection. His legion had developed the most comprehensive system for training and monitoring psychers, implementing safeguards that had prevented the catastrophic failures seen in less disciplined forces. The Crimson King's position was not merely academic. Magnus genuinely believed that psychic powers represented humanity's evolutionary destiny, the next stage in the species' development. He pointed to the Emperor himself as proof that psychers could achieve godlike mastery over the warp without succumbing to corruption. The astronomicon that guided ships through the warp relied on psychic power, as did the navigators who steered vessels through the Imperium's currents. Astropaths enabled communication across interstellar distances through their abilities. The Imperium's infrastructure depended on sanctioned psychers at every level. Denying Space Marines access to similar capabilities while expecting them to conquer the galaxy struck Magnus as both hypocritical and strategically foolish. The debate between these factions intensified throughout the later years of the Great Crusade, with various Primarchs aligning themselves according to their own experiences and philosophical inclinations. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels supported Magnus, recognizing that his own legion's librarians provided crucial capabilities that conventional warriors could not replicate. Jagatai Khan maintained his Stormseers despite growing pressure to disband them, arguing that the White Scars traditions predated the Imperium and should not be casually discarded. Lorgar of the Word Bearers, still smarting from the Emperor's censure at Monarchia, quietly supported the anti-psyker faction, though his motivations remained opaque even to his brothers. The Emperor finally called for a formal gathering to resolve the issue, summoning his sons to the world of Nicaea in the 30th millennium. The planet had been selected for its symbolic significance as a place where imperial truth had triumphed over religious superstition during early compliance operations. The Emperor intended the council to serve as a definitive statement on the role of psychers within the legions, ending the divisions that threatened to undermine inter-legion cooperation. He commanded that representatives from all sides present their arguments before an assembly of Primarchs, senior legion commanders, and imperial officials. The proceedings would be recorded and distributed throughout the Imperium, ensuring that the final decision carried unquestionable authority. The Council of Nicaea convened in a massive amphitheater constructed specifically for the occasion. Thousands of attendees filled the tiered seating, with space marines from every legion present to witness the debate. The Emperor presided from an elevated throne, his presence dominating the chamber even when he remained silent. The council's format allowed both prosecution and defense to present witnesses and evidence supporting their positions. Mortarion spoke first, delivering a methodical condemnation of psychic powers that drew on specific examples of corruption and failure. He brought forward testimony from Imperial army commanders who had witnessed librarians losing control during combat, their accounts describing horrors that made even veteran space marines uncomfortable. Leman Russ followed with his own arguments, framing the issue in terms of loyalty and purity. He questioned whether warriors who relied on warp powers could truly be trusted to resist corruption when the forces they channeled actively sought to subvert and dominate human minds. The Wolf King's testimony carried particular weight because he spoke not as a theorist, but as a warrior who had fought in the galaxy's darkest corners. He described encounters with xenopsychers and human witches, battles where the enemy's supernatural abilities had killed Imperial soldiers in ways that left no physical wounds. Russ insisted that the legions should not adopt the weapons of humanity's enemies, especially when those weapons carried inherent risks that could not be fully controlled or understood. Magnus mounted the defense with characteristic passion and intellectual rigor. The Crimson King presented detailed documentation of the Thousand Sons training protocols, demonstrating the safeguards his legion had implemented to prevent psychic corruption. He brought forward his own librarians as living proof that disciplined study could master the warp's dangers. Magnus argued that fear of psychic power stemmed from ignorance rather than genuine understanding. The warp was not inherently evil or corrupting. It was simply a dimension of reality that operated according to different principles than the Imperium. Refusing to study and understand these principles left humanity vulnerable to enemies who had no such reservations about harnessing psychic abilities. The Thousand Sons Primarch grew increasingly frustrated as the proceedings continued, particularly when witnesses testified about incidents that Magnus attributed to inadequate training rather than fundamental flaws in psychic study itself. He pointed out that conventional weapons also killed their users when handled improperly, yet no one suggested abandoning bolters or chainswords. The solution was better education and stricter oversight, not wholesale prohibition. Magnus's arguments demonstrated sophisticated understanding of warp mechanics, but this very sophistication worked against him. Many attendees struggled to follow his explanations, finding his descriptions of psychic phenomena abstract and unsettling. The council heard testimony from dozens of witnesses over several days. Some spoke in support of the librarious programs, describing situations where psychic warriors had provided critical intelligence or defensive capabilities that saved Imperial lives. Others recounted disasters where librarians had become conduits for warp entities, their bodies transformed into weapons that slaughtered their own brothers. The cumulative effect of these testimonies painted a picture of psychic power as inherently unstable, capable of tremendous benefit, but carrying risks that increased with every use. Even supporters of the librarius struggled to guarantee that their safeguards could prevent all possible failures. The Emperor's final judgment came after all testimony had been heard and all arguments presented. He delivered what became known as the Edict of Nicaea, a decree that fundamentally reshaped how the legions approached psychic powers. The Emperor ordered the immediate disbanding of all librarious departments across every Space Marine legion. Warriors who had served as librarians would return to conventional combat roles, forbidden from using their psychic abilities except in the most dire emergencies. The only exceptions to this prohibition were astropaths, navigators, and sanctioned psychers who served the broader Imperium under strict oversight. Space Marines would not be permitted to develop or employ psychic powers regardless of their training or discipline. The edict's language was absolute and unambiguous. The Emperor declared that the risks associated with psychic powers within the legions outweighed any tactical advantages such abilities might provide. He acknowledged Magnus's arguments about proper training and oversight, but concluded that even the most rigorous safeguards could not eliminate the fundamental dangers of warp exposure. The decision represented a complete victory for the anti-Psyker faction, validating every concern that Mortarion and Russ had raised. The Emperor commanded that all legions implement the edict immediately, dismantling their librarious infrastructure and reassigning affected warriors to standard combat duties. Magnus received the judgment as a personal repudiation, a rejection not just of his arguments but of his life's work. The Crimson King had dedicated centuries to understanding the warp, developing techniques and philosophies that he believed would elevate humanity to new heights of capability and understanding. The Emperor's edict declared all of this effort misguided at best and dangerous at worst. Magnus left Nicaea humiliated before his brothers, his legion's greatest strength suddenly classified as a liability to be suppressed. The Thousand Sons had built their entire culture around psychic mastery, incorporating it into every aspect of their operations and identity. The edict forced them to abandon what made them unique among the legions. The Council of Nicaea created fractures in relationships between Primarchs that had been forged over centuries of warfare. Magnus felt betrayed not just by the Emperor, but by brothers who had supported the Prohibition, despite knowing the Thousand Sons' achievements. The triumph that Mortarion and Russ experienced came at the cost of deepening Magnus's isolation and resentment. Other Primarchs who had maintained librarious programs, like Sanguinius and Jagatai Khan, complied with the edict but did so reluctantly, recognizing that they were surrendering capabilities that had proven valuable in combat. The Emperor's decision was final and unquestionable, but it left wounds that would not heal easily or quickly. The 63rd Expedition Fleet emerged from the warp into a region of space that defied every expectation the Imperium held about humanity's scattered diaspora. The fleet, commanded by Horus himself, with the Luna Wolves forming its core military strength, had been prosecuting the Great Crusade along the galaxy's eastern fringe, when their navigators detected signs of advanced human civilization in systems previously marked as unexplored. Initial auger sweeps revealed technological signatures consistent with Dark Age of technology capabilities, suggesting these humans had not only survived Old Night, but had somehow maintained their sophistication through millennia of isolation. The War Master ordered a cautious approach, dispatching scout vessels to gather intelligence before committing to full contact protocols. What the scouts discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's relationship with Xeno's species. The civilization called itself the Interrex, a confederation of worlds where humans lived alongside several alien races in what appeared to be genuine cooperation rather than subjugation or uneasy truce. The most prominent Xeno's partners were the Kindbrak, a species of simian-like beings whose technological prowess rivaled humanity's own achievements. The Kindbrak had developed weapons and armor that incorporated principles the Mechanicum would have classified as archaeotech, crafting equipment through methods that blended advanced metallurgy with techniques that bordered on artistic mastery. Other Xeno species filled specialized roles within Interrex society, their integration so complete that the civilization's infrastructure depended on multi-species collaboration. The Interrex maintained military forces that reflected their mixed composition. Human soldiers fought alongside Kindbrak warriors in formations that demonstrated centuries of tactical refinement. Their equipment showed none of the crude improvisation or technological regression that characterized most human worlds discovered during the Great Crusade. Instead, Interrex forces carried weapons that would not have looked out of place in Imperial arsenals, their armor incorporating powered systems and sophisticated targeting arrays. Their ships moved through the void with the confidence of a civilization that had mastered interstellar travel and maintained it without interruption. The Interrex had not merely survived Old Night. They had thrived, building a society that preserved humanity's technological heritage while incorporating Xeno's contributions into a functional whole. First contact occurred near the world of Zenobia, where Interrex patrol vessels intercepted Imperial scouts conducting reconnaissance sweeps. The Interrex ships did not immediately open fire, instead broadcasting greetings in a dialect of human language that had evolved separately from Imperial Gothic, but remained comprehensible to trained linguists. They requested peaceful dialogue, proposing a meeting between their leadership and the expedition's commanders. This response itself marked the Interrex as unusual. Most human civilizations encountered during the Great Crusade either welcomed the Imperium with desperate relief or resisted with varying degrees of effectiveness. The Interrex demonstrated neither submission nor hostility, approaching the situation with diplomatic protocols that suggested extensive experience in managing contact with unknown powers. Horus agreed to meet with Interrex representatives, recognizing an opportunity to potentially bring an advanced human civilization into compliance through negotiation rather than warfare. The War Master had always preferred diplomacy when dealing with human worlds, viewing unnecessary bloodshed as wasteful when reason might achieve the same objectives. He assembled a delegation that included senior Luna Wolves commanders, remembrancers assigned to document the expedition's achievements, and carefully selected representatives from other Imperial institutions. The meeting location was established on a neutral station, with both sides agreeing to limit military presence to ceremonial guards rather than combat-ready forces. The Interrex delegation arrived with a sophistication that impressed even veterans of hundreds of compliance actions. Their leaders wore armor that combined functional protection with aesthetic refinement, each piece clearly crafted by master artisans rather than mass-produced in manufactorums. They carried weapons openly, but held them in positions that conveyed readiness without aggression, a subtle distinction that spoke to military discipline and cultural confidence. The humans among the delegation stood alongside Kindbrak representatives as equals, their body language showing none of the tension that typically characterized human-Xenos interactions in Imperial experience. They presented themselves as ambassadors of a mature civilization, rather than isolated survivors desperate for rescue or protection. The negotiations began with formal exchanges of information about each civilization's history and current status. Horus explained the Imperium's origins, describing how the Emperor had unified Terra and launched the Great Crusade to reunite humanity's scattered colonies. He spoke of the Imperium's achievements, the hundreds of worlds brought into compliance, the elimination of Xenos threats that had preyed on human populations throughout Old Night. The War Master presented the Imperium as humanity's rightful government, the only force capable of protecting the species from the dangers that lurked in the galaxy's dark corners. His words carried conviction born from 2 centuries of warfare, painting a picture of imperial strength and inevitable expansion. The Interrex representatives listened with careful attention, asking questions that revealed their own sophisticated understanding of galactic politics and military power. They did not dispute the Imperium's achievements or question its strength. Instead, they raised concerns about Imperial policies toward Xeno species and the aggressive nature of the Great Crusade's expansion. The Interrex explained their own history, describing how they had survived Old Night through cooperation with the Kindbrak and other species. They argued that humanity's survival did not require Xeno's extinction, that peaceful coexistence offered advantages that pure human supremacy could not match. Their civilization had prospered for thousands of years using this model, avoiding the catastrophic conflicts that had consumed other regions of the galaxy. The most significant moment in these early discussions came when Interrex representatives raised the subject of what they termed cows, a concept that immediately captured Horus's attention. They spoke of dangers that dwelled in the warp, entities that sought to corrupt and manipulate sentient beings through their emotions and desires. The Interrex had developed extensive knowledge about these threats through millennia of careful study and bitter experience. They maintained strict protocols for identifying and containing cows' corruption, treating it as the most serious danger their civilization faced. Their warnings carried weight because they clearly understood what they were discussing, using terminology and concepts that demonstrated genuine comprehension rather than superstitious fear. Horus found himself fascinated and disturbed in equal measure by the Interrex's openness about warp-related dangers. The Imperium had deliberately obscured information about the warp's true nature, treating such knowledge as restricted to the highest levels of imperial authority. The Emperor had established this policy to protect humanity from corruption, reasoning that ignorance provided better defense than partial understanding. Yet here was a human civilization that had not only survived with full knowledge of the warp's dangers, but had apparently thrived by confronting these threats directly rather than hiding from them. The Interrex treated cows as a known enemy to be guarded against through vigilance and discipline, not a secret to be locked away from general awareness. The War Master engaged the Interrex representatives in extended discussions about their understanding of cows and the methods they employed to protect their population from corruption. They described sophisticated monitoring systems that could detect warp taint before it manifested in dangerous forms. Their society incorporated regular screenings and educational programs that taught citizens to recognize signs of cows' influence in themselves and others. The Kindbrak contributed their own perspectives on warp dangers, their species having developed different but complementary approaches to maintaining psychic hygiene. The Interrex's entire civilization had been structured around the principle that knowledge and preparation provided better protection than enforced ignorance. These revelations created tension within the Imperial delegation. Some officers questioned why the Emperor had chosen to keep humanity ignorant about warp dangers when the Interrex demonstrated that informed populations could resist corruption effectively. Others argued that the Interrex's small scale allowed for monitoring and control measures that would be impossible to implement across the Imperium's millions of worlds. The debate remained largely private, confined to discussions among senior commanders who recognized the sensitive nature of questioning imperial policy. Horus himself maintained careful neutrality in these conversations, but observers noted his thoughtful silence when others defended the Emperor's approach. The negotiations continued over several weeks, with both sides exploring potential frameworks for cooperation or integration. The Interrex made clear they would not simply submit to imperial authority, viewing their independence and their multi-species society as fundamental to their identity. They proposed instead a partnership between equals, suggesting that the Imperium might benefit from studying the Interrex's methods for managing Xenos relations and warp threats. This proposal was unacceptable under Imperial doctrine, which recognized no equals and permitted no permanent alliances with Xenos tolerant civilizations. Yet Horus hesitated to simply declare the Interrex non-compliant and initiate military action, recognizing that destroying such an advanced human civilization would represent a genuine loss for humanity as a whole. The Interrex invited Imperial representatives to visit their worlds and observe their society firsthand, hoping that direct exposure would demonstrate the viability of their model. Horus accepted, bringing a carefully selected group that included remembrancers, Luna Wolves officers, and representatives from other legions attached to the 63rd expedition. Among these was Erebus of the Word Bearers, a chaplain whose legion had been assigned to support the Luna Wolves during this phase of the Great Crusade. Erebus had maintained a low profile during the initial negotiations, observing proceedings with the quiet intensity that characterized the Word Bearers' approach to new situations. The Interrex worlds presented a vision of human civilization that contrasted sharply with imperial norms. Cities incorporated architecture that blended human and Xenos aesthetic principles, creating urban environments where multiple species lived and worked in integrated communities. The streets showed none of the rigid segregation that characterized imperial worlds where Xenos were permitted to exist at all. Humans and Kindbrak conducted business together, their interactions displaying the casual familiarity of long-established relationships rather than the wariness of forced coexistence. The Interrex had built a genuine multi-species society, not merely a human civilization that tolerated Xenos' presence. The Interrex maintained museums and cultural institutions that preserved knowledge about the dangers they had faced throughout their history. One such facility, the Hall of Devices, housed artifacts recovered from conflicts with cows, corrupted forces, and other threats. The Interrex treated these items as educational tools, using them to teach their population about the specific dangers each represented. Security around the hall was sophisticated but not paranoid, reflecting the Interrex's confidence in their population's ability to resist corruption through knowledge rather than ignorance. Imperial visitors received guided tour of the facility, observing collections that included weapons tainted by warp exposure, technological artifacts from fallen civilizations, and carefully preserved examples of Chaos corruption in physical form. Among the artifacts housed in the Hall of Devices was a weapon of Kindbrak manufacture, a sword called the Anatheme. The blade had been recovered from a Kindbrak faction that had fallen to Chaos corruption centuries earlier, its metal infused with warp energies through rituals that the Interrex's records documented in clinical detail. The sword remained dangerous even in its secured state, its presence causing subtle distortions in local reality that sensitive individuals could detect. The Interrex preserved it as a teaching tool, using the Anatheme as an example of how even the most sophisticated species could fall to corruption when they abandoned vigilance and discipline. The weapon's history and nature were fully documented, its dangers clearly understood by Interrex scholars who studied such artifacts professionally. Erebus observed the Anatheme with interest that went beyond academic curiosity. The word-bearer had spent the weeks of negotiation conducting his own investigations, speaking with Interrex citizens and gathering information about their society's vulnerabilities. He had identified the Hall of Devices as a potential target well before the Imperial delegation received permission to visit. The chaplain's interest in the Anatheme specifically suggested premeditation, though he maintained perfect composure during the tour, asking questions that seemed designed to gather technical information about the hall's security systems rather than the artifacts themselves. The theft occurred during the final night of the Imperial delegation's visit to the Interrex homeworld. Someone infiltrated the Hall of Devices using methods sophisticated enough to bypass security systems that had protected the facility for centuries. The intruder moved directly to the Anatheme's location, suggesting precise knowledge of the hall's layout and the specific artifact they sought. They extracted the blade without triggering alarms until their exit, when automated systems finally detected the breach. By the time Interrex security forces responded, the thief had disappeared into the city, leaving no physical evidence beyond the empty case that had housed the Anatheme. The Interrex response was immediate and uncompromising. They sealed their worlds and demanded that the Imperial delegation submit to searches and questioning. Their accusations focused on the Imperials as the only outsiders with access to detailed information about the hall's contents and layout. The Interrex had spent centuries protecting their population from Chaos artifacts, and the theft of the Anatheme represented not just a security breach, but a fundamental violation of trust. Their military forces mobilized to full readiness, preparing for the possibility that the theft was merely the opening move in a larger Imperial operation. The atmosphere shifted from cautious cooperation to barely contained hostility within hours. Horus found himself in an impossible position. He could not prove Imperial innocence without conducting investigations that would insult the Luna Wolves and other legions under his command by implying they harbored thieves. The Interrex refused to continue negotiations until the Anatheme was recovered, viewing its theft as evidence that the Imperials were either complicit in Chaos corruption or so careless with warp-tainted artifacts that they posed an unacceptable danger. The War Master's attempts to de-escalate the situation foundered against Interrex intransigence and growing anger among his own forces, who viewed the accusations as attacks on their honor and loyalty. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Interrex forces attempted to detain Imperial personnel for questioning. Luna Wolves warriors interpreted this as hostile action, responding with the reflexive aggression that characterized the Legion's combat doctrine. The first shots were fired in confusion and anger rather than calculated strategy, but once violence began, it escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. Interrex soldiers engaged Imperial forces across multiple locations, their sophisticated equipment and tactical training allowing them to inflict casualties that shocked space marines accustomed to overwhelming conventional human opposition. The Kindbrak warriors fought with particular effectiveness, their weapons capable of penetrating power armor through principles that Imperial forces did not fully understand. Horus ordered a fighting withdrawal to Imperial ships, recognizing that the situation had collapsed beyond recovery. The 63rd Expedition Fleet extracted its ground forces under fire, with Interrex vessels harassing the evacuation and inflicting damage on several Imperial ships. The Warmaster faced a choice between abandoning the region entirely or committing to full-scale warfare against a civilization that had moments earlier been potential allies. The theft of the Anatheme had destroyed any possibility of peaceful integration, transforming the Interrex from cooperative partners into enemies who possessed dangerous knowledge about Imperial vulnerabilities and warp-related threats. The decision to prosecute war against the Interrex came not from strategic calculation, but from the fundamental incompatibility between Imperial doctrine and the Interrex's multi-species society. Even if trust could have been rebuilt after the theft, the Imperium could not accept the continued existence of a powerful human civilization that embraced Xeno's cooperation and rejected Imperial authority. The 63rd Expedition Fleet regrouped and prepared for sustained military operations, bringing the full weight of Space Marine capabilities against an enemy that understood modern warfare and possessed technology capable of challenging Imperial superiority. The conflict would drag on for months, consuming resources and lives in a war that both sides recognized as tragic and unnecessary. The Interrex fought with determination born from defending their homes and their way of life. They had built a civilization that proved human Xeno's cooperation could succeed, that knowledge about warp dangers could protect rather than corrupt, that alternatives to the Imperial model existed and functioned effectively. The war destroyed all of this, reducing sophisticated cities to rubble and scattering populations that had lived in peace for millennia. The Kindbrak suffered particularly heavy casualties, their warriors dying to protect human allies in a conflict that demonstrated both the strength of their partnership and its ultimate futility against Imperial military power. The Vox transmission from Davin reached the 63rd Expedition Fleet, while Horus still coordinated the final stages of the Interrex campaign. Imperial army forces that had been stationed on Davin's moon, soldiers who had fought alongside the Luna Wolves during the world's original compliance decades earlier, had ceased regular communications. When contact was finally reestablished, the reports painted a disturbing picture of systematic breakdown in military discipline and unexplained illness spreading through the garrison. The commander, Yugen Temba, had been a trusted officer who had earned commendations during the Great Crusade's early years. His messages now carried an edge of barely controlled panic, describing a plague that defied medical treatment and behavioral changes among his troops that suggested something far worse than conventional disease. Horus ordered an immediate investigation. Davin held significance beyond its strategic value because the world represented one of the Luna Wolves' early victories, a compliance action that had demonstrated the Legion's ability to win hearts as well as battles. The local population had embraced Imperial truth with genuine enthusiasm, abandoning their primitive warrior cults in favor of the secular enlightenment the Imperium promised. The Luna Wolves had maintained friendly relations with Davin's people, with some companies incorporating local traditions into their own practices through the warrior lodges that had become increasingly common throughout the Legion. The idea that something had gone catastrophically wrong on a world the Luna Wolves considered pacified troubled the Warmaster deeply. The expedition fleet translated into the Davin system to find the moon's orbital space empty of the patrol craft that should have maintained regular circuits. Augur readings detected energy signatures from the surface that matched Imperial equipment, but the patterns were irregular and showed none of the disciplined organization expected from professional military forces. Attempts to raise Temba's headquarters met with silence broken only by static and occasional bursts of what sounded like screaming. The fleet's astropaths reported sensing something wrong in the local warp space, a thickness to the Imperium that made communication difficult and left even the most experienced psychers feeling nauseated and disoriented. Horus assembled a strike force built around the First Company's Justaran Terminators, veterans who had fought at his side through countless campaigns. The War Master would lead the investigation personally, bringing sufficient force to handle any conventional threat while demonstrating to the Davanites that the Imperium had not abandoned them. Erebus requested permission to accompany the force, arguing that the word-bearer's expertise in managing populations that had fallen back into religious practices might prove useful if the garrison's collapse involved cultural regression. The chaplain's presence had become familiar during the expedition's recent operations, his counsel valued for its insight into human psychology and social dynamics. The Thunderhawks descended through Davin's moon atmosphere into air that tasted wrong even through helmet filters. The local environment had changed since the Luna Wolves' previous visit, with the vegetation showing signs of accelerated growth and decay occurring simultaneously. Trees that should have taken decades to reach maturity stood fully grown, but rotting from within, their bark weeping fluids that steamed when they touched the ground. The wildlife had either fled or died, leaving forests that should have echoed with animal calls silent except for the wind moving through diseased branches. The Astartes moved through this transformed landscape with weapons ready, their tactical displays showing no immediate threats but every instinct warning of danger. The Imperial Army garrison's main compound appeared intact from a distance, its walls and fortifications showing no signs of enemy assault. The closer the Luna Wolves approached, the more apparent it became that something had gone fundamentally wrong inside those walls. Bodies lay scattered in positions that suggested they had died while fleeing from something within the compound, rather than defending against external attack. The corpses showed signs of mutation, their flesh warped in ways that defied natural disease progression. Some had grown additional limbs or sensory organs in random locations. Others had simply collapsed inward, their bones dissolving while their skin remained intact, creating empty sacks of flesh that barely resembled human forms. The compound's interior revealed the full extent of the catastrophe. The garrison had not merely fallen to disease, but had descended into madness and violence that had consumed the entire force. Walls were covered in symbols painted in blood, crude representations of an 8-pointed star that appeared throughout the facility with obsessive repetition. The soldiers had turned on each other in frenzied combat that had left bodies stacked in corridors and rooms. Equipment lay abandoned or deliberately destroyed, with weapons broken and ammunition scattered, as though the garrison had rejected the tools of modern warfare in favor of more primitive violence. The stench of decay permeated everything despite the facility's air circulation system still functioning. The Luna Wolves found Yugen Temba in what had been the command center, though the man who had sent those final transmissions bore little resemblance to the officer Horus remembered. Temba had transformed into something that challenged the definition of human, his body swollen to massive proportions and covered in pustules that wept fluids the color of old brass. His eyes held a terrible awareness, suggesting that some fragment of the original man remained trapped inside the bloated shell. He wore the remnants of his Imperial Army uniform, the fabric stretched and torn across his distorted frame, and he carried a sword that radiated wrongness even to Astartes' senses dulled by decades of warfare. Temba spoke with a voice that carried harmonics no human throat should produce, addressing Horus by name and claiming to have been waiting for the War Master's arrival. He described the transformation that had overtaken the garrison not as disease, but as enlightenment, a revelation of truths that the Imperium had deliberately hidden from humanity. The powers he served had shown him the Emperor's lies, the false promises of imperial truth that denied humanity's connection to forces that had existed long before the Imperium's founding. Temba had embraced these powers willingly, leading his garrison into worship of entities that offered genuine transcendence rather than the Emperor's sterile rationalism. The corrupted officer explained that the warrior lodges on Davin had provided the perfect vector for spreading this new understanding. What had begun as innocent fraternal organizations, where Astartes and mortal soldiers could meet as equals, had been subtly guided toward darker purposes. The lodges had incorporated local Davinite practices that seemed harmless on the surface, but carried the seeds of something far more dangerous. Temba himself had been initiated into mysteries that he now recognized as preparation for his transformation, rituals that had opened his mind to the whispers of powers that dwelled in the warp. The lodges throughout the 63rd Expedition Fleet had been similarly compromised, their members unknowingly prepared to receive the same revelations that had consumed the Davin garrison. Horus ordered Temba's immediate execution, recognizing that whatever the man had become posed a threat beyond conventional military danger. The War Master's anger was directed not at Temba himself, but at the forces that had corrupted a loyal officer and transformed him into this obscenity. The Luna Wolves opened fire with bolters and plasma weapons, concentrating their firepower on the bloated figure that had once commanded Imperial soldiers with competence and honor. Temba absorbed the punishment with laughter that echoed through the command center, his transformed body proving resistant to damage that should have reduced him to component atoms. The creature that had been Yugen Temba moved with speed that defied its bulk, crossing the command center in a charge that scattered Terminators like toys. The sword it carried, the blade that would later be identified as the stolen anatheme, cut through ceramite armor as though the protection was parchment. Horus met the charge directly, his own weapons crackling with power as he engaged an enemy that represented everything the Great Crusade had been launched to destroy. The duel lasted only moments, with the War Master's superior skill and equipment overwhelming even Temba's warp-granted enhancements. The anatheme's blade caught Horus across the shoulder in the instant before Temba fell, opening a wound through the joint seam in the War Master's armor. The cut was shallow, barely more than a scratch by the standards of injuries Horus had sustained throughout 2 centuries of warfare. The Primarch felt the blade's touch as a cold burning that spread from the wound site with unnatural speed. He killed Temba with a strike that removed the creature's head, then stood over the corpse as his apothecaries rushed forward to assess the injury. The anatheme had fallen from Temba's dead hand, its blade still wet with Primarch blood, the metal seeming to pulse with satisfied malevolence. The wound refused to heal despite the immediate application of combat stimulants and cellular regeneration agents that should have closed any injury within minutes. The cold burning sensation intensified, spreading through Horus's shoulder and into his chest with each heartbeat. The War Master's enhanced physiology, designed by the Emperor himself to be virtually indestructible, could not fight off whatever poison or curse the anatheme had introduced into his system. Within hours of returning to the fleet, Horus had collapsed into fever dreams, his body temperature fluctuating between extremes that would have killed normal humans instantly. The Luna Wolves' apothecaries worked with desperate intensity to save their Primarch, employing every technique in their considerable arsenal. They attempted surgical intervention to remove contaminated tissue, only to find that the wound's corruption had spread beyond any possibility of excision. Chemical treatments designed to purge toxins from Astartes' bloodstreams proved useless against whatever afflicted Horus. Even direct intervention at the cellular level, using techniques that bordered on the forbidden, failed to slow the infection's progression. The War Master's condition deteriorated with terrifying speed, his superhuman constitution buying time but unable to overcome the anatheme's curse. Erebus observed the medical efforts with apparent concern, offering suggestions drawn from the word-bearer's experience with unusual afflictions encountered during the Great Crusade. The chaplain spoke privately with senior Luna Wolves officers, particularly those who belonged to the warrior lodges that had spread throughout the Legion. He reminded them that Davin's moon held sites sacred to the local population, places where the old traditions still commanded respect despite the world's compliance. The lodges had maintained connections with Davinite priests who claimed knowledge of healing practices that predated Imperial arrival. Perhaps these primitive methods, dismissed by Imperial science as superstition, held answers that advanced medicine could not provide. The suggestion found receptive ears among Luna Wolves who watched their Primarch dying despite the best efforts of Imperial medical technology. The warrior lodges had fostered relationships with local populations throughout the Great Crusade, learning traditions and practices that enriched the Legion's culture without compromising their loyalty to the Imperium. Davin's healing traditions might represent humanity's accumulated wisdom from before Old Night, knowledge that the Mechanicum's rigid orthodoxy had dismissed without proper investigation. The desperation to save Horus overcame any reluctance to explore unconventional options. A delegation of Luna Wolves officers approached the fleet's command staff with Erebus's suggestion, framing it as a final option when all conventional treatments had failed. They proposed bringing Horus to the Delphos, the building on Davin's moon that housed the Serpent Lodge, an organization of local priests who claimed mastery over spiritual afflictions. The lodge's reputation on Davin suggested they possessed genuine healing capabilities, their methods producing results that Imperial observers had attributed to placebo effects or spontaneous remission, rather than acknowledging the possibility of valid alternative medicine. With their Primarch hours from death, the Luna Wolves were willing to try anything that offered even the slimmest hope of success. The decision to transport Horus to the Serpent Lodge represented a fundamental break from Imperial protocol regarding Primarch medical care. Standard procedure required that any threat to a Primarch's life be addressed using only approved Imperial methods under the direct supervision of the most senior apothecaries and Mechanicum Biologi's adepts. Seeking treatment from primitive healers on a recently compliant world violated multiple regulations designed to protect the Imperium's most valuable military assets. Yet the officers who made this decision were not traitors or fools. They were desperate warriors watching their father and commander die, while Imperial science proved helpless to save him. The Serpent Lodge's interior bore little resemblance to Imperial medical facilities. The building's architecture incorporated Davinite aesthetic principles that emphasized organic curves and symbolic representations of the world's native serpent species. The priests who greeted the Luna Wolves wore robes decorated with scales and carried staffs topped with carved snake heads, their appearance calculated to evoke the old traditions that had governed Davin before compliance. They showed no surprise at being asked to treat a Primarch, moving with the confidence of individuals who had been expecting this exact situation. Their leader explained that Horus's affliction was spiritual rather than physical, requiring intervention that addressed the Warmaster's soul rather than merely his body. The ritual they proposed involved placing Horus in a trance state that would allow him to confront the source of his affliction directly. The Davinite priests described this as a journey into the spirit realm, a concept that made the attending Luna Wolves uncomfortable, but which they accepted due to their desperate circumstances. Erebus endorsed the approach, noting similarities to practices he had observed on other worlds, where spiritual healing traditions had produced verifiable results. The word-bearer's support carried weight with officers who had come to trust his counsel during the expedition's recent campaigns. The Luna Wolves placed their dying Primarch in the Serpent Lodge's central chamber, laying him on a stone platform that the priests claimed had been used for healing rituals since before human settlement of Davin. The Davinite healers began their ceremony, chanting in their native language while burning substances that filled the chamber with thick smoke. The attending Astartes watched through helmet filters as Horus's vital signs, already dangerously unstable, began fluctuating in patterns that suggested his consciousness was separating from his physical form. The Warmaster's eyes moved rapidly beneath closed lids, his body occasionally convulsing as though responding to stimuli only he could perceive. What occurred during Horus's time in the Serpent Lodge would remain unknown to the Luna Wolves who stood guard over their Primarch's body. They saw only the physical manifestations of whatever internal struggle consumed him, the way his wounds wept fluids that should not exist in Primarch physiology, the manner in which his skin sometimes seemed translucent enough to reveal the bones beneath. The ceremony lasted for days, with the Davinite priests maintaining their chants and rituals, while Horus fought battles in realms beyond normal human perception. The Luna Wolves could only wait and hope that their desperate gamble would save the Warmaster, rather than delivering him to forces they did not understand and could not fight. The decision to bring Horus to the Serpent Lodge met immediate resistance from Apothecary Vadin, the most senior medical officer present with the 63rd Expedition Fleet. Vadin had served the Luna Wolves for over a century, his expertise in Astartes physiology unmatched outside the highest echelons of the Mechanicum's Biologi's adepts. He had treated injuries that would have killed normal humans 1,000 times over, had witnessed the remarkable resilience of space marine biology in circumstances that defied conventional medical understanding. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he observed in the Serpent Lodge's temple on Davin's moon. The apothecary recognized immediately that the rituals being performed bore no resemblance to any legitimate healing practice. The chants employed by the Davinite priests followed patterns that seemed designed to resonate at frequencies that made even Astartes feel disoriented and uncertain. The substances they burned produced smoke that contained compounds Vaden's auto senses flagged as psychoactive, chemicals that could alter consciousness and lower mental defenses against external influence. The chamber itself had been constructed according to principles that created acoustic properties, amplifying the priest's voices, while producing subsonic vibrations that affected brain chemistry in ways Vaden found deeply troubling. More damning was the psychic signature that permeated the entire temple complex. Vaden possessed no psychic abilities himself, but decades of service had taught him to recognize the signs of warp taint when he encountered them. The air in the Serpent Lodge carried a thickness that had nothing to do with the ceremonial smoke, a weight that pressed against consciousness itself. The shadows in the corners of the chamber moved independently of any light source, writhing with suggestions of forms that should not exist in real space. The stone platform where Horus lay had been carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure themselves when observed peripherally. The apothecary voiced his objections to the senior Luna Wolves officers who had authorized this course of action, warning them that they were exposing their Primarch to dangers far worse than the anatheme's wound. He pointed out the obvious signs of warp corruption throughout the temple, the way the Davinite priests moved with the synchronized precision of individuals whose actions were being coordinated by external intelligence rather than individual will. Vaden argued that conventional imperial medicine had not exhausted all options, that bringing in specialists from Terra or consulting with the Emperor himself offered better prospects than trusting primitive healers whose methods reeked of the very forces the Imperium had been created to oppose. His protests fell on ears deafened by desperation and influenced by months of subtle preparation through the warrior lodges. The officers who had brought Horus to the Serpent Lodge had been carefully selected, their participation in lodge activities having exposed them to ideas and perspectives that undermined their resistance to unconventional approaches. They viewed Vaden's concerns as the reflexive conservatism of imperial dogma, the same rigid thinking that had dismissed Davinite traditions as primitive superstition without properly investigating their potential value. The Warmaster was dying, and imperial medicine had proven helpless. What harm could come from trying methods that the locals swore had healed afflictions beyond conventional treatment? Vaden found himself physically restrained when he attempted to remove Horus from the chamber by force. His brother apothecaries, men he had served alongside for decades, held him back while explaining that the ritual had already begun and interrupting it now might kill the Warmaster more certainly than allowing it to continue. The apothecary was escorted from the temple complex and confined to his quarters aboard the fleet flagship, his access to command communications restricted to prevent him from alerting other imperial authorities about what was occurring on Davin's moon. The Luna Wolves officers who ordered his detention did so with obvious reluctance, but their loyalty to Horus outweighed their respect for Vaden's medical expertise and his warnings about warp corruption. The ritual conducted by the Serpent Lodge's priests represented the culmination of plans that had been set in motion long before the anatheme drew Primarch blood. The Davinite healers were not primitive practitioners of folk medicine, but servants of powers that had manipulated events across multiple star systems to engineer this exact moment. The wound itself was merely a vector, a physical anchor that allowed those powers to reach through the veil between real space and the immaterium to touch Horus's consciousness directly. The ceremony's true purpose was not healing but transportation, projecting the Warmaster's awareness into the warp, where the Chaos Gods could speak to him without the interference of his physical form's innate resistance to corruption. Horus's consciousness separated from his dying body, and plunged into the Imperium with a violence that would have destroyed any mind less formidable than a Primarch's. The warp assaulted his senses with input that defied normal categorization, emotions given physical form, thoughts that possessed weight and substance, time flowing in directions that had no correlation to linear causality. The War Master found himself standing in a space that resembled the Imperial Palace on Terra, but constructed from materials that shifted between states of matter, according to rules that changed with each observation. The architecture incorporated elements from every world Horus had conquered, an amalgamation of human achievement spanning 2 centuries of the Great Crusade. The vision presented to Horus showed him a future that the entities manipulating his consciousness claimed awaited if he continued serving the Emperor's designs. He witnessed Terra transformed into a shrine world where the imperial truth had been abandoned in favor of religious worship that elevated the Emperor to godhood. Massive cathedrals dominated landscapes where reason and science had once held primacy, their spires reaching toward skies filled with the prayers of billions. Priests in ornate robes led populations in devotions to the god Emperor, their liturgies describing a divine being who had created humanity and demanded absolute spiritual submission. The Imperium Horus had fought to build, founded on secular enlightenment and rational thought, had been perverted into the very kind of theocratic tyranny the Great Crusade had been launched to eliminate. The vision showed Horus his own fate and that of his brother Primarchs in this imagined future. The Space Marine legions had been broken apart, their unity shattered into smaller formations that could never threaten the centralized authority on Terra. The Primarchs themselves had been systematically erased from Imperial history, their achievements attributed to the Emperor alone or forgotten entirely. Horus watched as remembrancers and iterators who had documented the Great Crusade were purged, their records destroyed or altered to remove references to the Primarchs and the Space Marines who had actually conquered the galaxy. The common citizens of the Imperium knew nothing of the warriors who had fought and died to bring them into the Emperor's domain, their sacrifices deemed irrelevant to the religious narrative that served Terra's political purposes. The entities guiding this vision directed Horus's attention to specific details calculated to inflame his pride and sense of betrayal. He saw the Luna Wolves, his beloved sons, stripped of their identity and renamed to serve purposes they had played no part in choosing. Their colors had been changed, their traditions suppressed, their very existence as the War Master's legion erased from official records. Other legions suffered similar fates, their Primarchs' legacies deliberately destroyed by an Imperium that feared what these warriors represented. The vision suggested that this future was not merely possible, but inevitable, the Emperor's true intentions finally revealed after the Primarchs had served their purpose in conquering the galaxy. The most damning element of the vision focused on the Emperor's current activities on Terra, the secret project that had drawn him away from the Great Crusade at its moment of greatest triumph. Horus witnessed laboratories deep beneath the Imperial Palace, where the Emperor worked on a creation that dwarfed even the Primarch project in ambition and scope. The vision showed vast machinery designed to manipulate the webway, the ancient network of tunnels through space that allowed travel without exposure to the warp. The Emperor intended to give humanity access to this network, eliminating dependence on warp travel and the navigators who guided ships through the Imperium. The vision presented this project as the ultimate betrayal, proof that the Emperor had always viewed the Primarchs and Space Marines as temporary tools to be discarded once they had served their purpose. The Webway project would make the Great Crusade's warriors obsolete, their ability to wage war across the galaxy rendered unnecessary when humanity could expand through safe corridors that bypassed the warp entirely. The Emperor had created the Primarchs not as sons, but as weapons, genetic constructs designed to conquer the galaxy, before being quietly retired or eliminated when they were no longer needed. The vision showed Horus a future where he and his brothers were imprisoned or destroyed, their dangerous power contained once the Emperor's true plans reached fruition. The entities orchestrating this vision remained hidden, their presence felt rather than seen as they guided Horus through scenes calculated to corrupt his loyalty. They spoke in voices that seemed to originate from Horus's own thoughts, making their arguments appear as logical conclusions rather than external manipulation. They pointed out inconsistencies in the emperor's behavior, the way he had kept secrets from his sons while demanding their absolute trust and obedience. They reminded Horus of the humiliation at Monarchia, where the emperor had forced Lorgar and the word-bearers to kneel before the ruins of their greatest achievement. They showed him the Council of Nicaea, where the emperor had rejected Magnus's wisdom and sided with Primarchs whose understanding of the warp was rooted in superstition rather than knowledge. The vision emphasized that the emperor had never treated the Primarchs as true sons or partners in building the Imperium. He had created them in laboratories, engineering their genetics to serve specific military purposes without considering their personhood or autonomy. He had scattered them across the galaxy as infants, either through carelessness or deliberate design, forcing them to struggle and suffer on alien worlds while he remained safe on Terra. When he finally retrieved them, it was not out of paternal love, but because he needed their military capabilities to prosecute his great crusade. Every interaction between the Emperor and his Primarchs had been transactional, calculated to maintain their loyalty while keeping them ignorant of his true intentions. Magnus, the Red's psychic presence, manifested within the vision like a lightning strike, his consciousness forcing its way through the warp to reach his brother, despite the vast distances separating their physical forms. The Crimson King had been monitoring the Imperium from his tower on Prospero when he detected the massive psychic disturbance surrounding Horus's soul. Magnus recognized immediately that his brother was under attack, his consciousness being subjected to manipulation by entities whose power dwarfed anything the Thousand Sons Primarch had previously encountered. Magnus projected himself into the warp with the full force of his considerable abilities, determined to warn Horus and pull him back from whatever trap had been set. The Crimson King's intervention came too late to prevent the corruption, but succeeded in alerting Horus to the fact that the vision was being externally imposed rather than representing genuine prophecy. Magnus manifested within the false future as a towering figure wreathed in crimson light, his psychic form more powerful and terrible than his physical body. He shouted warnings to Horus about the entities manipulating his perceptions, identifying them as the same warp predators that the Interrex had called cows. Magnus urged his brother to reject the vision and return to his body before the corruption became irreversible. The Thousand Sons Primarch's presence paradoxically reinforced rather than undermined the vision's effectiveness. Magnus himself had been censured at Nicaea, his life's work condemned as dangerous despite his protests that he understood the warp better than any of his brothers. His appearance within the vision served as living proof that the Emperor kept secrets from his sons, that he pursued projects on Terra while leaving the Primarchs ignorant of his true purposes. Magnus's warnings about warp entities manipulating Horus's perceptions raised the question of why the Emperor had never provided similar warnings, why he had chosen to keep his sons ignorant about the true dangers they faced when that ignorance made them more vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack. Magnus spoke desperately about the Webway project, trying to explain that the Emperor's work on Terra was meant to protect humanity rather than replace the Space Marines. The Crimson King had learned about the project through his own psychic investigations, his curiosity about the Emperor's activities leading him to probe the wards surrounding the Imperial Palace's deepest levels. Magnus understood that the Webway would free humanity from dependence on warp travel, eliminating the greatest vulnerability that had allowed Old Night to nearly destroy human civilization. The project represented the Emperor's attempt to secure humanity's future, not evidence of his intention to betray the Primarchs. Horus heard his brother's explanations through the filter of the corruption already taking root in his consciousness. Magnus's knowledge about the Webway project confirmed that the Emperor had been keeping secrets, pursuing goals he had not shared with the War Master, despite elevating him to supreme command of the Great Crusade. The fact that Magnus had discovered these secrets through unauthorized psychic investigation, rather than being told directly, proved that the Emperor did not trust his sons with information about his true plans. Every argument Magnus made in the Emperor's defense inadvertently reinforced Horus's growing conviction that he had been deceived and used. The entities guiding the vision pressed their advantage, showing Horus scenes of the Emperor working in his laboratories, while the Primarchs fought and died across the galaxy. They contrasted the Emperor's safety and comfort on Terra with the brutal realities of the Great Crusade, the endless warfare that consumed Space Marine lives by the thousands. They suggested that the Emperor had always intended to remain on Terra once the Primarchs were mature enough to lead the conquest themselves, that his participation in campaigns like Ulanor had been calculated to maintain the Primarchs' loyalty rather than genuine commitment to the Great Crusade's ideals. The corruption settled into Horus's consciousness, like poison into a wound, each argument and revelation adding another layer of resentment and betrayal. The War Master's pride, his greatest strength and his fundamental weakness, provided the perfect foundation for the entities to build their case. Horus had conquered the galaxy in the Emperor's name, had earned the title of War Master through 2 centuries of flawless military achievement, had proven himself the greatest of the Primarchs in both martial prowess and strategic brilliance. The vision suggested that all of this accomplishment would be forgotten, that the Emperor planned to discard him once the Webway project was complete and the Space Marines were no longer necessary. Magnus realized too late that his intervention had failed, that the corruption had progressed beyond the point where warnings could penetrate the carefully constructed narrative surrounding Horus's consciousness. The Crimson King withdrew from the warp, his psychic form retreating to Prospero while he desperately tried to formulate a way to alert the Emperor about what had occurred on Davin. Magnus understood that he had just witnessed the beginning of something catastrophic, that the entities who had corrupted Horus possessed power and cunning that threatened the entire Imperium. The warning he would eventually send to Terra would arrive in the worst possible manner, shattering the Emperor's Webway project and setting in motion events that would validate every fear the vision had planted in Horus's mind. The War Master's consciousness remained trapped in the warp for subjective eternities, while mere days passed in real space. The entities that had orchestrated his corruption continued their work, showing him visions that built upon the foundation of betrayal and resentment they had established. They offered him alternatives to the future they claimed the Emperor had planned, possibilities where the Primarchs claimed their rightful place as humanity's rulers rather than serving as discarded tools. They suggested that Horus could prevent the betrayal he had witnessed, that he possessed the power and authority to reshape the Imperium according to principles that honored the Space Marine sacrifices rather than erasing them from history. The corruption was not instantaneous transformation, but gradual erosion of loyalties that had defined Horus's entire existence. The entities worked with patient malevolence, understanding that they were corrupting not some weak-willed mortal, but a being created by the Emperor himself to be incorruptible. They exploited every doubt, every moment of frustration with Imperial bureaucracy, every instance where Horus had questioned the Emperor's decisions, but suppressed those questions out of loyalty and faith. The vision they had shown him provided context that transformed those suppressed doubts into evidence of systematic deception, reframing Horus's entire relationship with his creator as manipulation rather than partnership. When Horus finally emerged from the Serpent Lodge's ritual, his body had healed, but his soul carried wounds that would never close. The War Master's physical recovery appeared miraculous to the Luna Wolves who had watched him dying, proof that the Davinite healing traditions possessed genuine power that Imperial medicine lacked. Horus walked from the temple under his own strength, his bearing showing none of the weakness that had characterized his final hours before the ritual. He spoke words of gratitude to the officers who had brought him to the Serpent Lodge, commending their initiative and willingness to explore unconventional solutions when conventional approaches had failed. Apothecary Vadin, released from confinement once Horus had recovered, examined the War Master and found his physiology completely restored to normal function. The Anathame's wound had closed without scarring, the corruption that had been spreading through Horus's system completely eliminated. Every medical indicator suggested perfect health, Primarch biology functioning at peak efficiency. Yet Vadin noticed subtle changes in Horus's behavior that troubled him deeply, alterations in speech patterns and decision-making that suggested the War Master who had emerged from the Serpent Lodge was not quite the same being who had entered. The apothecary documented these observations in sealed reports that he transmitted to Terra through channels he hoped remained secure, warnings that would arrive too late to prevent the catastrophe already set in motion. The warrior lodges had existed within the Space Marine Legions for decades before anyone recognized them as vectors for corruption. Their origins traced back to the Luna Wolves' early campaigns, particularly the compliance of the world of Davin during the Great Crusade's first century. The Davanites practiced a warrior culture built around fraternal societies where men gathered to share stories of battle, conduct rituals that honored martial prowess, and forge bonds that transcended the normal hierarchies of their society. These lodges operated in secret, their membership cutting across tribal and clan boundaries to create networks of loyalty based on shared experience rather than blood or status. When the Luna Wolves brought Davin into compliance, the local population's warrior traditions impressed the Astartes who fought alongside them. The concept of a brotherhood that existed separate from the formal command structure appealed to Space Marines who spent their entire lives operating within rigid hierarchies dictated by company assignments and rank. The lodges offered something the legions did not provide: spaces where warriors could meet as equals regardless of whether they served as sergeants or line troopers, where grievances could be aired without fear of formal reprimand, where the bonds of shared combat experience mattered more than the accidents of promotion and assignment. The first Luna Wolves lodges formed shortly after Davin's compliance, with Astartes adopting modified versions of the Davanite practices they had observed. The initial gatherings were innocent enough, small groups of warriors meeting informally to discuss campaigns and share perspectives on battles they had fought. The lodges maintained secrecy, not out of any sinister purpose, but because their existence technically violated regulations about unauthorized gatherings and parallel command structures. Officers who discovered these meetings generally tolerated them as harmless outlets for warriors who spent years or decades away from Terra, prosecuting the Great Crusade's endless campaigns. The practice spread to other legions through the natural interaction that occurred when different forces fought together during major campaigns. Luna Wolves who had embraced the lodge tradition spoke enthusiastically about the benefits to their brothers in other legions, describing how the lodges strengthened unit cohesion and provided mental relief from the grinding stress of constant warfare. The Death Guard established their own lodges after fighting alongside the Luna Wolves during several protracted campaigns, their warriors appreciating the opportunity to discuss tactics and strategy without the formality that characterized official briefings. The Emperor's children adopted the practice with modifications that reflected their legion's emphasis on excellence and self-improvement, turning lodge meetings into forums for analyzing combat performance and identifying areas for refinement. The warrior lodges proliferated throughout the legions during the Great Crusade's middle years, becoming an accepted, if unofficial, part of Space Marine culture. By the time Horus received his appointment as War Master, lodges existed in nearly every legion to some degree, their membership including thousands of Astartes across hundreds of companies. The gatherings had evolved from simple story-sharing sessions into more structured organizations with initiation rituals, hierarchies of seniority based on combat experience, and traditions that varied between legions but maintained common elements derived from the original Davanite practices. The lodges had become institutions, woven into the fabric of how Space Marines related to each other outside the formal command structure. What none of the lodge members recognized was that their organizations had been infiltrated from the moment of their inception. The Davanite warrior traditions that inspired the first Luna Wolves lodges had themselves been corrupted long before Imperial forces arrived on that world. The rituals and practices that seemed to honor martial virtue and brotherhood contained elements carefully designed to make participants receptive to specific ideas and resistant to others. The lodge structure, with its emphasis on secrecy and loyalty to fellow members above formal authority, created perfect conditions for spreading seditious concepts while insulating those concepts from external scrutiny or challenge. Erebus and Corferon of the Word Bearers recognized the lodge's potential immediately. The two senior officers had spent decades since Monarchia's destruction working to undermine the Imperium from within, building networks of agents and sympathizers who could be activated when the time came to openly rebel against the Emperor's rule. The warrior lodges represented ready-made cells of influence scattered throughout the legions, organizations whose members had already accepted the principle that loyalty to the lodge could exist alongside and sometimes supersede loyalty to the formal command structure. The word-bearers needed only to guide these existing organizations toward more explicitly seditious purposes. The corruption of the lodges occurred gradually through the introduction of new practices and ideas that seemed to naturally evolve from existing traditions. Word-bearers who participated in joint campaigns with other legions would attend lodge meetings as guests, sharing variations on rituals they claimed enhanced the bonds between lodge brothers. These modified practices incorporated elements drawn from the chaotic beliefs that Erebus and Corferon had embraced after their pilgrimage to Cadia and other worlds touched by the warp's influence. The changes were subtle enough that lodge members did not recognize them as fundamentally altering the lodge's character, small additions to existing ceremonies that felt like organic developments rather than external corruption. Erebus proved particularly skilled at identifying which lodge members were most susceptible to the ideas he wanted to spread. He looked for warriors who felt undervalued by their legion's leadership, Astartes whose achievements had gone unrecognized, or who had been passed over for promotions they believed they deserved. These individuals carried resentments that made them receptive to suggestions that the Imperium's hierarchy was unjust, that the Emperor and his representatives on Terra did not properly value the Space Marines who actually conquered the galaxy. Erebus cultivated these warriors carefully, offering validation for their grievances while subtly directing their anger toward the Imperial system rather than their immediate commanders. The word-bearer also targeted warriors who had witnessed events that raised questions about the Emperor's judgment or the Imperium's direction. Astartes who had fought at Monarchia and seen the Ultramarines humiliate the word-bearers received particular attention, with Erebus framing that incident as evidence that the Emperor valued political control over truth and loyalty. Space Marines who had participated in the Council of Nicaea found themselves in conversations about how the Emperor's prohibition of librarians suggested he kept secrets from his sons, that he feared what the Primarchs might learn if they fully understood the warp's nature. Each doubt, each question, each moment of frustration with Imperial policy became raw material that Erebus shaped into broader narratives of betrayal and deception. The lodges became forums where these narratives could spread through seemingly organic discussion rather than obvious indoctrination. A warrior who had been passed over for promotion might mention his frustration during a lodge meeting, prompting another member to observe that the Imperium's promotion system favored political connections over combat achievement. Someone else would add their own example of perceived injustice, and gradually a consensus would emerge that the problem was systemic rather than isolated. Erebus and other word-bearers' agents would guide these discussions carefully, asking questions that led lodge members to draw increasingly radical conclusions, while maintaining the appearance that these ideas originated from the members themselves, rather than being imposed from outside. The systematic nature of this corruption became apparent in how similar ideas emerged in lodges across different legions and expedition fleets. Warriors who had never met each other began expressing identical concerns about the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra, using remarkably similar language to question why the Master of Mankind had abandoned the Great Crusade at its moment of greatest triumph. Lodge members across multiple legions simultaneously began discussing whether the Primarchs deserved more autonomy in how they prosecuted their campaigns, whether the restrictions imposed by the Council of Terra represented appropriate oversight or insulting micromanagement of warriors who had proven their capabilities through 2 centuries of victory. The Death Guard's lodges proved particularly fertile ground for Erebus's manipulation. The 14th Legion had always maintained a degree of separation from the broader Imperium's culture, their Primarch Mortarian's experiences on Barbarous having instilled deep suspicion of authority figures who claim to act in humanity's best interests. The Death Guard valued self-reliance and viewed dependence on external support as weakness, making them naturally receptive to arguments that Terra's bureaucracy undermined rather than supported the Legion's effectiveness. When Lodge discussions turned to questions about whether the Emperor truly understood the realities of the Great Crusade or had become disconnected from the warriors who actually fought his battles, Death Guard Astartes found these concerns resonating with their existing cultural attitudes. Kala's Typhon emerged as the most significant Death Guard officer to embrace the Lodge's increasingly seditious atmosphere. The first captain commanded the 14th Legion's elite First Company and served as one of Mortarian's most trusted subordinates, a warrior whose achievements during the Great Crusade had earned him respect throughout the Death Guard. Typhon had always harbored ambitions that exceeded his current position, viewing himself as deserving greater recognition than Mortarian provided. The Primarch's tendency to fight alongside his warriors rather than commanding from distant headquarters meant that opportunities for independent glory were limited, with victories attributed to the Death Guard as a whole rather than individual officers. Typhon's participation in the warrior lodges brought him into contact with ideas that validated his sense of underappreciation and offered explanations for why his achievements had not translated into the recognition he believed he deserved. Lodge discussions suggested that the Imperium's rigid hierarchy deliberately suppressed exceptional individuals to maintain control, that the Emperor and his representatives feared warriors who might accumulate enough personal power to challenge Terra's authority. Typhon found these arguments compelling, particularly when they came from Lodge brothers in other legions, who shared similar frustrations about being constrained by superiors who did not understand or appreciate their capabilities. Erebus identified Typhon as a crucial asset early in the corruption process, recognizing that the Death Guard First Captain's influence within his legion could be leveraged to spread seditious ideas throughout the 14th's command structure. The Word-Bearer cultivated a relationship with Typhon through lodge meetings and private conversations, offering the kind of validation and recognition that Mortarian had never provided. Erebus spoke of Typhon's achievements in terms that emphasized the first captain's individual brilliance, rather than attributing success to the Death Guard's collective strength, feeding the warrior's ego while subtly directing his resentment toward the imperial system that failed to properly reward exceptional service. The Emperor's children presented different opportunities for corruption, their legion's culture of pursuing perfection, creating vulnerabilities that Erebus exploited through different approaches. Lord Commander Eidolon commanded significant influence within the 3rd Legion, his position as one of Fulgrim's senior officers giving him authority over large portions of the Legion's operations. Eidolon exemplified the Emperor's children's pursuit of excellence in all things, his combat record demonstrating the kind of flawless execution that characterized the Legion's approach to warfare. Yet this very perfectionism created frustration when circumstances prevented the achievement of ideal outcomes, when the realities of campaigning across the galaxy forced compromises that offended the Emperor's children's aesthetic sensibilities. The lodges within the 3rd Legion became venues for discussing how imperial policies and restrictions prevented the Emperor's children from achieving their full potential. Lodge members complained about being forced to coordinate with Imperial Army units, whose incompetence undermined carefully crafted battle plans, about having to accept equipment and supplies that met minimum standards rather than the superior quality the Legion deserved. These grievances were framed not as mere complaints, but as evidence that Terra did not truly understand or value what made the Emperor's children exceptional, that the Imperium's bureaucracy treated all legions as interchangeable, rather than recognizing each one's unique capabilities and requirements. Eidolon absorbed these arguments with the same intensity he brought to perfecting his combat techniques, finding in them explanations for the frustrations he had experienced throughout his service. The Lord Commander had witnessed the Emperor's children forced to compromise their standards due to logistical constraints, had seen brilliant tactical plans degraded by the need to accommodate allied forces that could not match the Third Legion's capabilities. The Lodge discussions suggested that these problems stemmed from systemic flaws in how the Imperium operated, that the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra had removed the one authority figure who truly understood what the Space Marines required to prosecute the Great Crusade effectively. The corruption spreading through the lodges was not uniform across all legions or all members. Some Space Marines recognized the seditious nature of the discussions and withdrew from lodge participation, viewing the increasingly political conversations as inappropriate for warriors who should focus on their duty rather than questioning imperial policy. Others participated in lodge meetings without embracing the more radical ideas being promoted, treating the gatherings as social occasions rather than ideological forums. The effectiveness of Erebus's manipulation varied depending on individual circumstances, personal grievances, and the specific culture of each legion. The Luna Wolves lodges occupied a unique position in this network of corruption because they enjoyed the War Master's tacit approval. Horus had never formally endorsed the lodges, but he had not moved to suppress them either, viewing them as harmless outlets that actually strengthened unit cohesion by providing warriors with venues to discuss their experiences outside the formal command structure. This tolerance from the War Master himself gave the Luna Wolves lodges legitimacy that similar organizations in other legions lacked, making it easier for lodge members to justify their participation and harder for critics to argue that the gatherings violated regulations or undermined discipline. When Horus emerged from the Serpent Lodge on Davin's moon, his attitude toward the warrior lodges shifted from tolerance to active support. The War Master began attending lodge meetings personally, his presence transforming these gatherings from unofficial social events into forums where the Imperium's most senior military commander shared his thoughts about the Great Crusade's direction and the Emperor's decisions. Horus spoke carefully during these meetings, never directly advocating rebellion or explicitly criticizing the Emperor, but his words carried implications that lodge members absorbed and amplified. When the War Master questioned whether Terra's bureaucracy truly understood the challenges the legions faced, lodge members heard validation for their own frustrations with imperial oversight. The network of lodges across multiple legions provided Erebus and Cor Ferron with infrastructure for coordinating the coming rebellion without relying on official communication channels that might be monitored by loyalist forces. Lodge members who had embraced the seditious ideas spreading through these organizations could be activated when needed, their existing bonds of brotherhood ensuring they would support each other when the time came to openly defy imperial authority. The lodges had become cells of a conspiracy that spanned dozens of legions and hundreds of worlds, their members united by shared grievances and the conviction that the Imperium had betrayed the warriors who had conquered the galaxy in the Emperor's name. The destruction of Monarchia had been absolute and methodical, executed with the cold efficiency that characterized the Ultramarines in all their operations. Roboute Guilliman's 13th Legion descended upon the city that Lorgar had built as a monument to the Emperor's divinity, systematically dismantling structures that had taken decades to construct. The Word-Bearers watched from orbit as their greatest achievement burned, forced to witness the humiliation without being permitted to defend what they had created. The Emperor himself had arrived to oversee the punishment, his presence ensuring that no one could question the authority behind this act of destruction. When the fires finally died and the smoke cleared, nothing remained of Monarchia except ruins and ash, a wasteland where a thriving city of millions had stood days before. The Emperor commanded the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel in the dust of their destroyed city, 17,000 Space Marines forced to prostrate themselves, while Guilliman and the Ultramarines stood as witnesses to their shame. Lorgar knelt at the front of his legion, the golden skin that marked him as different from his brothers, now covered in the gray ash of Monarchia's destruction. The Emperor's condemnation was delivered without anger or passion, a simple statement of fact that the Word-Bearers had failed in their purpose. They had been created to bring worlds into compliance with imperial truth, to spread the secular enlightenment that would free humanity from superstition and religious delusion. Instead, they had done the opposite, fostering the very beliefs the Great Crusade had been launched to eliminate. The Emperor explained that Lorger's writings and preaching had established the foundation for an imperial cult that threatened to spread across compliant worlds. The citizens of Monarchia and dozens of other planets brought into compliance by the word-bearers worshipped the Emperor as divine, building temples and conducting rituals that directly contradicted everything imperial truth represented. This was not merely an embarrassment or a deviation from proper compliance procedures. It represented a fundamental failure to understand the Great Crusade's purpose, a rejection of the rationalism that was supposed to define humanity's future. The Emperor had tolerated Lorger's eccentricities for decades, hoping the Primarch would eventually recognize his errors and correct them. Monarchia's destruction proved that tolerance had failed and harsher measures were required. Lorger received the Emperor's words as a son hearing his father declare him worthless. The Primarch had spent his entire life searching for truth, first on Colchis, where he had been raised by the priest Corferon, then across the galaxy as he brought world after world into what he believed was enlightenment. Everything Lorger had done, every city built, and every sermon preached, had been motivated by genuine love for the Emperor and desire to honor the being who had created him. The word-bearer's slow pace of compliance compared to other legions stemmed not from incompetence, but from Lorger's insistence on truly converting populations, rather than simply forcing their submission. He had believed he was serving the Emperor's interests by ensuring that compliant worlds embraced imperial ideals with religious fervor rather than grudging acceptance. The Emperor's rejection shattered the foundation of Lorger's existence. If the being he had worshipped as divine rejected that worship, if the father he had served with absolute devotion declared that service worthless, then everything Lorger had believed about reality was wrong. The Primarch rose from the ashes of Monarchia with his faith in crisis, his certainty replaced by questions that consumed his thoughts during the long journey back to the word-bearer's fleet. Lorger had built his entire identity around faith and devotion, had structured the 17th Legion's culture to reflect these values. Without the Emperor as the object of that faith, Lorger found himself adrift in a universe that suddenly seemed empty of meaning or purpose. Corferon watched his adopted son's crisis with satisfaction hidden beneath expressions of sympathy and support. The old priest had never truly embraced imperial truth, viewing it as a useful fiction that allowed him to maintain his position of influence within the word-bearers. Corferon had studied the old religions of Colchis before the Emperor's arrival, texts that spoke of powers dwelling in the warp that predated humanity and would exist long after the Imperium crumbled to dust. The priest had recognized elements of truth in these ancient writings, references to entities that matched phenomena he had observed during his decades of service. Monarchia's destruction provided the perfect opportunity to guide Lorger toward these older, darker faiths. Erebus shared Corferon's secret knowledge and his contempt for imperial truth's naive rationalism. The first chaplain had risen to prominence within the word-bearers through a combination of political skill and genuine charisma, his sermons inspiring warriors who had never questioned why they fought. Erebus had maintained the appearance of loyal service while privately exploring forbidden texts recovered from compliant worlds, documents that described the warp's true nature in terms that contradicted everything the Imperium taught. The destruction of Monarchia confirmed what Erebus had long suspected. The Emperor feared genuine faith because he understood that humanity's capacity for belief could be directed toward powers he could not control. The two conspirators approached Lorger carefully in the weeks following Monarchia's destruction, speaking in private conversations that gradually introduced concepts drawn from Colchis's old religions. They reminded Lorger that faith itself was not wrong, that the human need for something greater than mere material existence was fundamental to the species. The Emperor's rejection of worship did not invalidate the impulse toward devotion. It simply meant that the object of that devotion had been misidentified. Corferon spoke of his studies on Colchis, describing religions that had persisted for thousands of years because they addressed genuine aspects of human experience that rationalism could not satisfy. These faiths spoke of powers in the warp, entities that answered prayers and granted blessings to those who served them properly. Lorgar listened to these arguments with the desperate attention of someone drowning and being offered a lifeline. The Primarch's crisis of faith had left him vulnerable in ways he had never experienced before, his certainty replaced by doubt that corroded his ability to function as a military commander. The word-bearers had slowed their compliance operations to a near halt, while their Primarch struggled to find new meaning in a universe where the Emperor had rejected his worship. Corferon's suggestions offered a path forward, a way to maintain faith while redirecting it toward entities that actually desired worship rather than rejecting it. The old priest spoke of gods plural rather than singular, powers that each represented different aspects of existence and together encompassed the full spectrum of sentient experience. The decision to undertake a pilgrimage in search of these new gods came from Lorgar himself, though Corferon and Erebus had carefully prepared the ground for exactly this conclusion. The Primarch announced to his senior officers that the word-bearers would temporarily suspend compliance operations to engage in a spiritual journey, a quest to understand the true nature of divinity and humanity's place in the cosmos. This declaration was framed as necessary recovery from the trauma of Monarchia's destruction, time required for the Legion to rebuild its sense of purpose before returning to the Great Crusade. Most word-bearers accepted this explanation without question, trusting their Primarch's wisdom and recognizing that the Legion needed to heal before it could effectively prosecute further campaigns. The pilgrimage's first destination was Cadia, a world located near a region of space where the boundary between real space and the warp had worn thin over millennia. The planet had been brought into compliance decades earlier, its population absorbed into the Imperium without particular difficulty or distinction. What Corferon knew but had never reported to Imperial authorities was that Cadia sat adjacent to a permanent warp rift, a tier in reality through which the Immaterium's energies leaked into the material universe. The planet's population had developed unique characteristics over generations of exposure to this warp contamination, mutations that manifested subtly enough to escape notice during the compliance action, but which marked Cadians as fundamentally changed from baseline humanity. The word-bearers arrived at Cadia to find a world that seemed normal on the surface, but which felt wrong to anyone sensitive to warp phenomena. The local population exhibited unusual resistance to psychic influence and warp exposure, their genetics having adapted to constant low-level contamination in ways that made them valuable as soldiers, but also marked them as touched by forces the Imperium did not fully understand. Corferon guided Lorgar to sites on Cadia, where the warp's presence was strongest, locations where ancient structures built by civilizations long extinct still channeled Immaterium energies into real space. These ruins predated human settlement of Cadia by thousands or millions of years, their architecture incorporating principles that seemed designed to weaken the barriers between dimensions. Lorgar stood before these ancient structures and felt the presence of something vast and terrible pressing against reality from the other side of the veil. The sensations were not entirely unfamiliar. Every psyker experienced the warp's touch to some degree, the way the Immaterium's currents brushed against consciousness like invisible tides. What Lorgar felt on Cadia was different in scale and intent, intelligence rather than mere natural force, awareness that recognized his presence and responded to it. The Primarch opened his mind to these sensations, despite every instinct warning him to maintain his mental defenses, his desperate need for new faith overriding the caution that had protected him throughout decades of service. The entities dwelling in the warp responded to Lorgar's openness, with visions that made the Primarch's previous understanding of reality seem childishly limited. He witnessed the Immaterium's true nature, not the empty void that Imperial doctrine described, but a realm teeming with life and consciousness that existed according to rules fundamentally different from those governing material space. The warp was not merely a dimension used for faster-than-light travel, but an entire universe unto itself, populated by beings whose power dwarfed anything that existed in real space. These entities had observed humanity since the species first developed consciousness, feeding on the emotions and beliefs of sentient minds, while occasionally reaching through the veil to influence material events. Four powers dominated the warp, entities so vast and ancient that calling them gods was not metaphor but simple description of their nature. Each represented fundamental aspects of sentient experience given form and consciousness through the collective psychic energy of every thinking being in the galaxy. The first was rage and martial pride, the drive to conquer and destroy that lurked in every warrior's heart. The second embodied decay and endurance, the acceptance of mortality and the strength found in surviving despite inevitable decline. The third represented excess and perfection, the pursuit of sensation and achievement pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The fourth was change and ambition, the desire to accumulate knowledge and power regardless of cost or consequence. These chaos gods, as Corferon named them using terminology from Calcas's old religions, desired worship in ways the Emperor never had. They offered genuine reciprocity to their followers, granting power and favor in exchange for devotion and service. The visions showed Lorgar civilizations that had embraced these gods and prospered, their populations achieving capabilities that made imperial technology seem primitive by comparison. The Chaos Gods promised that humanity could transcend its current limitations, that the species could evolve into something greater than mere flesh and blood if it would only acknowledge the warp's primacy and submit to the powers that dwelled there. Lorgar emerged from his communion with the Chaos Gods, convinced that he had finally found truth after a lifetime of searching. The Emperor's rejection of worship now made sense as the jealous response of a being who understood that greater powers existed, but refused to acknowledge them. Imperial truth was revealed as a lie designed to keep humanity ignorant of its true potential, a cage constructed by the Emperor to maintain his control over a species that could achieve godhood if properly guided. The Primarch's crisis of faith resolved into new certainty, his devotion redirected from the Emperor to entities that actually welcomed and rewarded worship. The word-bearers who accompanied Lorgar on this pilgrimage underwent similar revelations, their own exposure to the Chaos God's influence converting them from loyal servants of the Imperium into the first Space Marines to knowingly pledge themselves to the ruinous powers. The transformation was not instantaneous corruption, but gradual acceptance of new truths that contradicted everything they had been taught. These warriors had followed their Primarch into the warp-touched regions of Cadia because they trusted Lorgar's wisdom and shared his need for new purpose after Monarchia's destruction. What they found there was faith more demanding and rewarding than anything Imperial truth had offered, gods who answered prayers with tangible blessings rather than maintaining distant silence. The pilgrimage continued to other worlds, where the warp's influence had left its mark on human populations. The word-bearers visited planets that had been isolated during Old Night, their civilizations developing in directions that incorporated warp phenomena into daily life rather than fearing and suppressing such manifestations. Some of these worlds had been brought into compliance, and their populations forcibly converted to Imperial truth, their traditions destroyed and their knowledge of the warp suppressed. The word-bearers found survivors who still practiced the old ways in secret, priests and witches who maintained forbidden knowledge about the Chaos Gods and the rituals required to gain their favor. Lorgar studied these forbidden practices with the same intensity he had once devoted to crafting sermons praising the Emperor. The Primarch compiled new texts that synthesized the various traditions he encountered, creating a coherent theology that explained the Chaos God's nature and humanity's proper relationship with these powers. The Book of Lorgar, as this work became known among the word-bearers, described the warp not as a threat to be avoided, but as humanity's destiny to be embraced. Lorgar argued that the Emperor's Great Crusade had been fundamentally misconceived, that attempting to impose rationalism on a species whose consciousness was inherently connected to the warp was not just futile, but actively harmful to humanity's development. The decades following Monarchia's destruction saw the word-bearers transform from the Emperor's most devoted servants into his most dangerous enemies, though this transformation remained hidden beneath continued participation in compliance operations. The 17th Legion resumed its contributions to the Great Crusade, bringing worlds into Imperial control, while secretly spreading worship of the Chaos Gods among populations that Imperial authorities believed had been converted to Imperial truth. The word-bearers became expert at maintaining two faces, presenting themselves as loyal servants of the Imperium while actually working to undermine everything the Emperor had built. Erebus took personal responsibility for spreading the corruption beyond the word-bearers, using his position as first chaplain to establish contacts with other legions during joint operations. The chaplain identified warriors whose personalities or circumstances made them vulnerable to Chaos's influence, cultivating relationships that could be exploited when the time came to openly rebel against the Emperor's authority. The warrior lodges provided perfect cover for these activities, allowing Erebus to spread seditious ideas while maintaining plausible deniability about his true purposes. The first chaplain moved between legions like a virus, infecting each force he encountered with doubts about the Emperor and suggestions that alternatives to Imperial rule existed and deserved consideration. Corferon focused his efforts on the word-bearers themselves, ensuring that the entire legion embraced the new faith rather than merely tolerating their Primarch's eccentricities. The old priest established new training protocols that incorporated warp-based practices into standard combat doctrine, teaching word-bearers how to channel chaos energies to enhance their physical capabilities and protect themselves against psychic attack. These techniques were presented as recovered knowledge from humanity's past rather than gifts from the Chaos Gods, allowing word-bearers to rationalize their use of powers that would have been condemned as sorcery if their true source had been acknowledged. The word-bearer's transformation created the template that would later be used to corrupt other legions, a systematic process of breaking down loyalty to the Emperor while building up devotion to the Chaos Gods. Lorgar and his senior officers learned through trial and error which arguments proved most effective at undermining faith in the Imperium, which promises from the Chaos Gods resonated most strongly with Space Marines who had spent their entire lives as warriors. The 17th Legion became expert at identifying the specific grievances and desires that made individual Astartes vulnerable to corruption, tailoring their approach to exploit each warrior's unique psychological weaknesses. The preparation for wider rebellion required patience and careful planning that tested even Lorgar's newfound certainty. The word-bearers could not simply announce their allegiance to the Chaos Gods and expect other legions to follow. Such an approach would result in immediate condemnation and destruction by loyalist forces. Instead, the corruption had to spread gradually through networks of personal relationships and shared grievances, each converted warrior becoming an agent who could influence others within his legion. The process would take decades and require coordinating actions across dozens of legions and hundreds of worlds, but Lorgar and his co-conspirators had time, and the Chaos Gods favor supporting their efforts. The word-bearers identified Horus as the crucial target for corruption long before the War Master's wounding on Davin. Lorgar recognized that his brother's position as supreme commander of all Imperial military forces made him uniquely positioned to fracture the Imperium if he could be turned against the Emperor. The challenge was finding an approach that would work on a Primarch whose loyalty had never wavered, whose relationship with the Emperor seemed unshakable despite any disagreements about strategy or policy. The word-bearers needed circumstances that would create genuine doubt in Horus's mind about the Emperor's intentions, a crisis severe enough to make the War Master receptive to ideas he would normally reject without consideration. The theft of the anatheme from the Interrex had been orchestrated specifically to create such a crisis, though the weapon's use required careful timing and circumstances that would allow it to wound Horus without arousing immediate suspicion about word-bearers' involvement. Erebus had stolen the blade personally during the Imperial delegation's visit to the Interrex homeworld, recognizing its potential as soon as he learned about the weapon's properties. The Kindbrak forged sword carried warp contamination that could affect even Primarch physiology, its edge capable of inflicting wounds that would not heal through normal means. More importantly, the anatheme's curse would require treatment that conventional Imperial medicine could not provide, creating the necessity for alternatives that would expose Horus to direct chaos influence. The corruption of Yugen Temba and his garrison on Davin's moon had been accomplished through the warrior lodges that Erebus had carefully nurtured during the 63rd Expedition fleet's earlier campaigns. The word-bearer had identified Temba as an officer whose ambition exceeded his position, whose frustration with the slow pace of promotion in the Imperial army made him receptive to promises of power and recognition. Erebus had guided Temba into deeper involvement with Davin's Serpent Lodge, exposing the officer to rituals that gradually opened his mind to chaos influence. By the time the 63rd Expedition fleet returned to the Davin system, Temba and his garrison had been completely corrupted, transformed into the bait that would draw Horus into the trap the word-bearers had prepared. Horus returned to the 63rd Expedition fleet with his body healed, but something fundamental had shifted in the War Master's bearing that those who knew him best could not quite identify. The change was not dramatic enough to raise immediate alarm. He still commanded with the same tactical brilliance that had earned him the position of War Master, still spoke with the charisma that had always inspired absolute loyalty from the Luna Wolves. Yet certain officers noticed subtle alterations in how Horus approached decisions and interacted with his brothers. The War Master, who had always sought consensus among his Primarch brothers, now seemed more willing to act unilaterally, issuing orders that repositioned entire legions across the galaxy without the extensive consultation that had previously characterized his command style. The first significant redeployment came within weeks of Horus's recovery. The War Master issued orders reassigning several legions to new operational theaters, justifying the moves as necessary optimization of the Great Crusade's strategic disposition. The word-bearers received instructions to prosecute compliance actions in the Viridian system, a cluster of worlds that intelligence reports suggested harbored significant human populations, but posed no immediate military threat. The assignment seemed reasonable on its surface, directing the 17th Legion toward objectives that matched their capabilities while allowing other forces to focus on more challenging targets. What the orders did not reveal was that the Viridian system's location would place the word-bearers in perfect position to support operations that Horus was only beginning to plan. The Death Guard found themselves reassigned to the Istvan system, tasked with bringing several worlds into compliance that had resisted previous Imperial contact. Mortarion accepted the assignment without question, viewing it as appropriate employment for his legion's particular strengths in grinding attritional warfare. The 14th Legion specialized in endurance, their ability to sustain operations in hostile environments making them ideal for protracted campaigns where other forces might falter. The Istvan system's worlds were reported to have developed sophisticated defensive networks during their isolation, requiring exactly the kind of methodical siege warfare that the Death Guard had perfected over decades of service. Mortarion gathered his forces and departed for Istvan, unaware that the system would become the staging ground for events that would shatter the Imperium. Fulgrim and the Emperor's children received orders to rendezvous with the Iron Hands Legion under Ferrus Manus, coordinating a joint campaign against a Xenos empire that threatened several compliant worlds in the Eastern Fringe. The assignment made tactical sense given the close relationship between Fulgrim and Ferrus, the two Primarchs having maintained a friendship since the Great Crusade's early years. The Emperor's children and Iron Hands had fought together successfully in previous campaigns, their contrasting approaches to warfare complementing each other effectively. Fulgrim's legion pursued perfection in execution, while Ferrus's warriors embodied relentless mechanical efficiency, the combination proving devastating against enemies who faced both simultaneously. Angron and the World Eaters were directed toward compliance operations in regions where resistance had proven particularly fierce, assignments that played to the 12th Legion's reputation for brutal close-quarters combat. The World Eaters had become the Imperium's instrument for situations where terror and overwhelming violence were deemed necessary to break enemy morale. Angron's warriors fought with a savagery that disturbed even other Space Marines, their Primarch's influence having shaped the Legion into something that barely resembled the disciplined force originally created on Terra. The Butcher's nails implanted in Angron's skull drove him toward constant aggression, a neurological modification that he had inflicted upon his own sons, despite the Emperor's explicit prohibition against such augmentation. Perdurabo and the Iron Warriors received assignments that continued the pattern of siege warfare and fortification construction that had defined their service throughout the Great Crusade. The 4th Legion had built or broken more fortresses than any other Space Marine force, their Primarch's genius for siegecraft making them invaluable for operations where conventional assault would prove too costly. Yet these assignments consistently placed the Iron Warriors in supporting roles rather than positions of prominence, using their capabilities to enable other legions' victories, while the 4th received little recognition for their contributions. Perdurabo's growing resentment at this treatment made him increasingly receptive to arguments that the Emperor and the War Master's staff did not properly value the Iron Warriors' sacrifices. The strategic repositioning of legions across the galaxy occurred gradually enough that no single redeployment raised immediate concern. Horus justified each reassignment with sound tactical reasoning, demonstrating the same strategic acumen that had characterized his command since receiving the War Master's laurel at Ulanor. The cumulative effect of these moves, however, was to separate legions whose loyalty to the Emperor remained absolute from those forces that Horus and his co-conspirators had identified as potentially corruptible. The Ultramarines found themselves committed to campaigns in Ultramar. Roboute Guilliman's attention focused on consolidating control over the 500 worlds rather than monitoring events elsewhere in the galaxy. The Dark Angels under Lionel Johnson received orders that sent them to the galaxy's northern fringe, pursuing reports of a significant Xenos threat that required immediate attention. The 1st Legion's departure removed from the broader strategic picture a force whose Primarch possessed both the military capability and the suspicious nature to potentially recognize what Horus was orchestrating. The Lion had never been comfortable with political maneuvering, preferring straightforward military objectives to the complex web of relationships and obligations that characterized inter-legion cooperation. His absence from the core, regions where the Heresy would begin, eliminated a Primarch who might have rallied loyalist forces before the conspiracy could fully mature. The Blood Angels and their Primarch Sanguinius received assignments that kept them engaged in compliance operations far from Terra, their reputation and capabilities employed against enemies that required the 9th Legion's particular combination of mobility and striking power. Sanguinius maintained close relationships with several of his brothers, particularly Horus, and his presence near the centers of power might have complicated the War Master's plans. The Angel's ability to inspire loyalty and his reputation for wisdom made him dangerous to conspirators who relied on spreading doubt about the Emperor's intentions. Keeping Sanguinius occupied with distant campaigns reduced the risk that he would detect the corruption spreading through the legions until it was too late to prevent the coming catastrophe. The White Scars under Jagatai Khan found themselves assigned to campaigns along the Great Crusade's eastern frontier, regions where their expertise in rapid warfare and hit-and-run tactics proved invaluable against enemies who controlled vast territories but lacked concentrated military strength. The Khan had always maintained a degree of independence from the broader imperial hierarchy, his legion operating with minimal oversight while achieving objectives through methods that other Primarchs found unconventional. This independence, normally viewed as a strength, meant that the White Scars remained disconnected from events occurring in other operational theaters, their focus narrowed to immediate tactical concerns rather than broader strategic patterns. The Space Wolves remained with Leman Russ in regions where their particular capabilities were deemed necessary, though the 6th Legion's assignments increasingly isolated them from other loyalist forces. Russ had served as the Emperor's executioner, the Primarch tasked with eliminating threats too dangerous or too close to the throne for conventional military action. His reputation and his legion's fearsome combat prowess made them potentially dangerous to Horus's plans, but the Wolf King's absolute loyalty to the Emperor could be exploited by providing him with targets that would keep him occupied while the conspiracy matured. Russ trusted his brothers, particularly Horus, and would not easily believe accusations of treachery without overwhelming evidence. The Imperial fists under Rogel Dorn received orders recalling them to Terra, ostensibly to oversee the fortification of the Imperial Palace and the Sol system's defensive networks. Dorn's expertise in defensive architecture made him the logical choice for such an assignment, and the Praetorian of Terra accepted the recall without question. The 7th Legion's departure from active Great Crusade operations removed from the field a force whose Primarch possessed both unwavering loyalty and the strategic insight to potentially recognize the pattern behind Horus's redeployments. Yet Dorn's recall also placed him exactly where the Emperor needed him most, positioning the Imperial fists to defend Terra when the Heresy finally erupted into open warfare. Horus met with his brother Primarchs individually during the months following his recovery, private conversations that occurred during brief windows when their respective campaigns brought them into proximity. The War Master's approach to each brother reflected careful consideration of their individual personalities and grievances, exploiting weaknesses that years of observation had revealed. Fulgrim received visits where Horus spoke of the Emperor's children's unmatched perfection, validating the 3rd Legion's sense of superiority, while subtly suggesting that such excellence deserved greater recognition than Terra provided. The War Master reminded Fulgrim of how the Emperor's children had rebuilt themselves from near destruction after a genetic catastrophe had reduced their numbers to barely 200 warriors, achieving through sheer determination what other legions took for granted. The conversations with Fulgrim turned gradually toward questions about whether the Emperor truly appreciated what the 3rd Legion had accomplished, whether the Master of Mankind understood the sacrifices required to maintain the standards of perfection that define the Emperor's children. Horus never explicitly criticized the Emperor during these discussions, instead asking questions that led Fulgrim to draw his own conclusions about perceived slights and insufficient recognition. The War Master mentioned how the Emperor had departed for Terra without acknowledging the Emperor's children's recent victories, how the 3rd Legion's achievements were often overshadowed by the Ultramarines' greater numbers or the Blood Angels' dramatic heroics. Each observation planted seeds of resentment in soil that Fulgrim's pride had already prepared to receive them. Angron presented different challenges and opportunities for corruption. The Primarch of the World Eaters had never hidden his hatred for the Emperor, openly expressing contempt for the being who had denied him the death he desired on New Syria. Angron had led a slave rebellion on his homeworld, fighting alongside brothers and sisters who had shared his suffering in the gladiatorial pits. When the Emperor arrived to claim his son, Angron had been surrounded by enemies with his fellow rebels dying around him. The Emperor had teleported Angron away from the battle, saving the Primarch but abandoning the rebels to their deaths. Angron had never forgiven this intervention, viewing it as the ultimate betrayal by a father who valued his genetic creation more than the family Angron had chosen for himself. Horus approached Angron not with subtle manipulation, but with direct acknowledgement of the 12th Primarch's grievances. The War Master spoke plainly about the Emperor's failures as a father, the way he had treated the Primarchs as tools rather than sons. Horus reminded Angron of how the Emperor had forbidden the implantation of the Butcher's nails in World Eater's warriors, then ignored the practice when Angron defied the prohibition. This pattern of establishing rules then failing to enforce them, when violation proved inconvenient, demonstrated the Emperor's hypocrisy. His willingness to compromise principles when doing so served his purposes. The War Master suggested that the Emperor's departure to Terra represented abandonment of the Primarchs now that the Great Crusade's most difficult campaigns had been completed, the Master of Mankind retreating to safety while his sons continued to fight and die. Mortarian's recruitment required appealing to the Death Guard Primarch's deep-seated hatred of tyrants and his conviction that self-reliance represented the highest virtue. Horus met with Mortarian during a brief convergence of their respective fleets, the two Primarchs discussing strategy and logistics in conversations that gradually shifted toward more philosophical territory. The War Master spoke of how the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra had left the legions dependent on a bureaucracy that did not understand military realities, how the Council of Terra's oversight undermined the Primarch's ability to prosecute the Great Crusade effectively. Horus mentioned specific instances where administrative delays or resource allocation decisions had compromised military operations, each example reinforcing Mortarian's existing belief that centralized authority inevitably became disconnected from the realities faced by those it claimed to serve. The War Master reminded Mortarian of the Emperor's intervention on Barbarus, how the Master of Mankind had arrived to claim his son, just as Mortarian was preparing to assault the final fortress of the overlords who had ruled his homeworld. The Emperor had climbed to that fortress himself, defeating the overlord that Mortarian had spent his entire life preparing to face. This act, presented as assistance, had robbed Mortarian of the victory that would have defined his identity and proven his worth. Horus suggested that this pattern characterized the Emperor's relationship with all his sons, the Master of Mankind inserting himself into their achievements to ensure they remained dependent on his power rather than confident in their own capabilities. Perdurabo's corruption required acknowledging the Iron Warrior's contributions, while validating the Fourth Primarch's conviction that his legion received insufficient recognition for their sacrifices. Horus spoke of how the Iron Warriors had built the fortifications that allowed other legions to achieve glory, how Perdurabo's genius for siege warfare had enabled victories that were credited to the forces who made the final assaults rather than the legion who had made those assaults possible. The War Master mentioned specific campaigns where the Iron Warriors had suffered heavy casualties in grinding siege operations, while other legions received the accolades for breaching walls that Perdurabo's warriors had weakened through weeks or months of methodical bombardment. The Fourth Primarch had always felt undervalued compared to brothers like Rogel Dorn, whose defensive expertise received constant praise, while Perdurabo's equally sophisticated understanding of fortification was taken for granted. Horus exploited this resentment by suggesting that the Emperor deliberately undervalued the Iron Warriors because their capabilities threatened the Imperial Fist's reputation as the Imperium's premier siege force. The War Master pointed out how Dorn received assignments that showcased his legion's strengths, while Perdurabo was consistently given tasks that, while critical, lacked the visibility that would earn the Iron Warriors proper recognition. This pattern suggested systematic bias rather than mere oversight, evidence that the Emperor and his advisors actively worked to suppress acknowledgement of the Fourth Legion's achievements. The corruption of these Primarchs did not occur through single conversations, but through sustained campaigns of subtle manipulation that exploited existing grievances while introducing new doubts about the Emperor's intentions. Horus never explicitly advocated rebellion during these early discussions, instead asking questions and making observations that led his brothers toward conclusions that served the conspiracy's purposes. The War Master's approach varied with each Primarch, reflecting his deep understanding of his brothers' personalities and the specific vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to corruption. Some, like Angron, required only validation of their existing hatred. Others, like Fulgrim, needed careful cultivation of pride into resentment before they would consider acting against the Emperor. The gathering storm that would become the Horus Heresy built through these individual corruptions and the strategic repositioning of legions across the galaxy. Horus moved pieces on a board whose full dimensions remained hidden from most observers, positioning forces loyal to his cause while isolating or occupying legions whose Primarchs would resist the coming rebellion. The War Master maintained perfect operational security, conducting his conspiracy through private meetings and carefully controlled communications that left no evidence of coordination between the corrupted legions. Each Primarch who embraced Horus's cause believed himself to be making an independent decision based on his own assessment of the Emperor's failures, unaware that their conclusions had been carefully engineered through months or years of manipulation. Nathaniel Garro had served the Death Guard since the Legion's founding, his record of service spanning decades of warfare across hundreds of worlds. The battle captain commanded the frigate Eisenstein and the Death Guard's 7th Company, his reputation for tactical competence and unwavering loyalty making him one of Mortarian's most trusted subordinates. Garo had fought in some of the Great Crusade's most brutal campaigns, his company earning distinction for their ability to sustain operations in environments that would break lesser forces. Yet despite his long service and proven capabilities, Garo had never been initiated into the warrior lodges that had spread throughout the Death Guard during recent years. The battle captain's exclusion from the lodges was not accidental. Garo's personality combined absolute loyalty to the Emperor with a rigid adherence to regulations and proper procedure that made him unsuitable for the kind of subtle corruption that Erebus and his agents had spread through these organizations. Warriors like Garo represented potential obstacles to the conspiracy, officers whose integrity and devotion to duty would make them resistant to arguments about the Emperor's failures or the need for the legions to assert greater independence from Terra's authority. The lodge members had identified Garo as someone who could not be corrupted and had deliberately kept him isolated from the discussions occurring within their meetings. This isolation meant that Garo observed the changes spreading through the Death Guard from outside the network of lodge brothers who had embraced the new ideas circulating through the Legion. The battle captain noticed subtle shifts in how his brother officers spoke about the Emperor and the Imperium, changes in tone and emphasis that suggested their loyalty had become qualified rather than absolute. Conversations that would have previously focused on tactical considerations now included political commentary about Terra's bureaucracy and questions about whether the Emperor truly understood the challenges the legions faced. Garo found these discussions troubling, but could not identify any specific violation of regulations or duty that would justify reporting his concerns to higher authority. The battle captain's unease intensified when the Death Guard received their orders for the Istvan system. The assignment itself seemed straightforward, but Garo noticed that Mortarian was coordinating with other legions in ways that deviated from standard operational procedures. The World Eaters and Emperor's children would be operating in the same region, their presence justified by the scale of resistance expected on Istvan's worlds. Yet the level of coordination between these legions exceeded what previous joint operations had required, suggesting planning that went beyond the immediate military objectives. Garo could not articulate exactly what troubled him about these arrangements, only that they felt wrong in ways his decades of experience told him merited attention. Rogel Dorn had returned to Terra at the Emperor's summons, the Imperial Fists recalled from active campaigning to oversee the fortification of humanity's throne world. The Praetorian accepted this assignment with his characteristic methodical approach, immediately beginning comprehensive assessments of the Sol system's defensive networks and the Imperial Palace's structural integrity. Dorn's expertise in siege warfare and defensive architecture was unmatched among the Primarchs, his understanding of fortification combining theoretical knowledge with practical experience gained through decades of building and breaking strongholds across the galaxy. The Emperor had chosen the perfect Primarch for the task of making Terra impregnable against any conceivable assault. Yet even as Dorn worked to strengthen Terra's defenses, he found himself troubled by reports filtering back from the Great Crusade's active theaters. The War Master's redeployment of legions made tactical sense when examined individually, but the cumulative pattern suggested strategic objectives that Dorn could not fully discern. Horus was positioning forces in ways that created unusual concentrations of power in certain regions, while leaving others with minimal Space Marine presence. The 7th Primarch's instincts, honed through 2 centuries of warfare, suggested that these deployments reflected preparation for operations beyond routine compliance actions. Dorn attempted to raise his concerns with the War Master through official channels, requesting clarification about the strategic objectives driving the recent redeployments. Horus's responses were professionally crafted and superficially reasonable, explaining each decision in terms of operational efficiency and resource optimization. Yet the answers felt incomplete to Dorn, as though the War Master was providing justifications that addressed the immediate questions while avoiding discussion of broader strategic intentions. The Imperial Fist's Primarch found himself in the uncomfortable position of questioning his brother's judgment without possessing evidence of actual wrongdoing, his concerns rooted in intuition rather than concrete proof of improper action. The Praetorian's attempts to discuss his unease with the Emperor met with limited success. The Master of Mankind remained focused on his work in the Imperial Palace's deepest levels, the Webway project consuming his attention in ways that made him less accessible than he had been during the Great Crusade's active prosecution. Dorn understood that his father's work was critical to humanity's future, but the Emperor's preoccupation meant that concerns about Horus's redeployments received less scrutiny than the 7th Primarch believed they warranted. The situation created a growing sense of isolation for Dorn, who found himself monitoring events he could not directly influence while working to fortify Terra against threats he could not fully identify. The Istvan system had fallen into rebellion through circumstances that Imperial records would later struggle to fully explain. The Third Planet, a world that had been brought into compliance decades earlier without significant resistance, had suddenly ceased all communication with Imperial authorities and expelled the administrative personnel stationed there to maintain order. Reports from the few officials who escaped described a population that had rejected Imperial truth and embraced practices that resembled the religious cults the Great Crusade had been launched to eliminate. The planetary governor, a man named Vardis Prahl, had declared independence from the Imperium and established himself as a theocratic ruler whose authority derived from powers he claimed dwelt beyond human understanding. The War Master received intelligence reports about Istvan III's rebellion while coordinating fleet movements across multiple sectors. Horus reviewed the information with the careful attention he brought to all strategic assessments, noting that the world's location and industrial capacity made it a potentially significant threat if the rebellion spread to neighboring systems. The planet maintained manufactorums capable of producing military equipment, and its population numbered in the billions, providing substantial manpower for any force that could organize and arm them effectively. More concerning were reports suggesting that Prahl had somehow acquired weapons and equipment that exceeded what a recently compliant world should possess, indicating either hidden stockpiles from before Imperial arrival or external support from unknown sources. The decision to deploy 4 full legions to bring Istvan III back into compliance appeared justified by the scale of the threat and the need to demonstrate that rebellion against Imperial authority would be crushed with overwhelming force. The Sons of Horus, as the Luna Wolves had recently been renamed in honor of their Primarch, would lead the operation alongside the Death Guard, World Eaters, and Emperor's Children. The concentration of Space Marine power assigned to this single system exceeded what most compliance actions required, but Horus explained the deployment as necessary to ensure rapid resolution and to send a message to any other worlds considering similar defiance. The War Master personally assumed command of the operation, his presence guaranteeing that the rebellion would receive the full attention of the Imperium's supreme military commander. The fleet that gathered above Istvan III represented one of the largest concentrations of Space Marine power assembled since Ulanar. Hundreds of ships filled the orbital space, their presence alone sufficient to cow most rebellious populations into immediate surrender. The 4 legions brought nearly 50,000 Astartes warriors, supported by millions of Imperial Army soldiers, and the full logistics infrastructure required to sustain extended military operations. The Sons of Horus occupied the fleet's center, their ships displaying the new heraldry that marked them as the War Master's own legion. The Death Guard's vessels maintained their positions with the methodical precision that characterized Mortarian's approach to all military operations. The World Eater's fleet showed signs of barely controlled aggression, their ships positioning themselves for immediate planetary assault. The Emperor's Children maintained formation with the perfect discipline expected from Fulgrim's warriors. Horus spent the days before the assault conducting detailed briefings with his senior commanders, reviewing intelligence about Istvan III's defensive capabilities and the disposition of Prahl's forces. the War Master's tactical acumen remained as sharp as ever, his analysis identifying weaknesses in the rebel defenses that could be exploited to minimize Imperial casualties while ensuring rapid victory. Yet certain officers noticed peculiarities in how Horus selected which companies and squads would form the initial assault waves. The War Master personally reviewed unit rosters, making adjustments that placed specific warriors in the vanguard, while holding others back for secondary operations. The selections did not follow the normal patterns of assigning the most experienced or capable units to spearhead assaults, instead distributing veterans and newer warriors in ways that seemed almost random to observers who lacked full context. Nathaniel Garrow found himself troubled by these deployment decisions when he reviewed the Death Guard's assignments. The battle captain noticed that many of the warriors selected for the initial assault were those who had never joined the warrior lodges, officers and line troopers whose loyalty to the Emperor remained absolute and unquestioned. Conversely, prominent lodge members found themselves assigned to reserve positions or garrison duties that would keep them aboard the fleet during the opening phases of the operation. Garrow mentioned this pattern to other officers outside the lodge network, finding that they had observed similar distributions within their own companies. The explanations provided by senior commanders seemed reasonable when examined individually, but the cumulative effect created a deployment that segregated loyalist and lodge-affiliated warriors in ways that defied conventional tactical logic. Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children had earned his reputation through decades of exemplary service, his record demonstrating the combination of martial excellence and tactical competence that defined the 3rd Legion at its best. The captain commanded respect from his brother officers and the warriors under his command, his leadership style emphasizing the pursuit of perfection in all aspects of warfare. Tarvitz had never felt comfortable with the warrior lodges despite pressure from fellow officers to join, his instincts warning him that the organizations fostered loyalties that could potentially conflict with duty to the Legion and the Imperium. This resistance to lodge membership had not harmed his career, but it had created subtle distance between Tarvitz and officers who had embraced the lodge culture. The captain noticed the same deployment patterns that troubled Garrow, recognizing that the Emperor's Children selected for the initial assault included a disproportionate number of warriors who had avoided lodge involvement. Tarvitz brought his concerns to Lord Commander Eidolon, expecting that the senior officer would share his unease about assignments that seemed to segregate the Legion according to criteria unrelated to combat capability. Eidolon dismissed the concerns with explanations that emphasized the need to blood newer warriors while preserving veteran strength for more challenging operations expected in later phases. The Lord Commander's responses felt rehearsed to Tarvitz, as though Eidolon was repeating justifications he had been given rather than offering his own tactical assessment. Garville Loken had served as captain of the Sons of Horus 10th Company since before the Legion's renaming, his position making him one of the War Master's most trusted subordinates. Loken embodied the ideals that had defined the Luna Wolves during their greatest campaigns, combining absolute loyalty to Horus with unwavering commitment to the principles of imperial truth. The captain had fought in some of the Great Crusade's most significant battles, his tactical competence and personal courage earning him respect throughout the 16th Legion. Yet Loken had grown increasingly troubled by changes he observed in the Legion's culture following Horus's recovery from his wounding on Davin, subtle shifts in how his brother officers spoke about the Emperor and the Imperium's direction. The captain had never joined the warrior lodges despite their prevalence throughout the Sons of Horus, viewing them as unnecessary complications to the clear chain of command that should govern Legion operations. This decision had created friction with lodge members who interpreted Loken's refusal as judgment of their choices, though the captain had never openly criticized the organizations or those who participated in them. When Loken reviewed the deployment orders for Istvan III, he immediately recognized that he and other non-lodge officers were being assigned to lead the initial assault waves, while prominent lodge members remained with the fleet. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting deliberate selection criteria that had nothing to do with tactical considerations. Tarik Torgadin commanded the Sons of Horus Second Company and had maintained a close friendship with Loken since their early service together. The captain's personality combined genuine warmth with the martial excellence expected of all Space Marines, his ability to maintain morale and unit cohesion making him invaluable during extended campaigns. Torgadin shared Loken's concerns about the deployment patterns, the two captains discussing their observations during the final preparations before the assault. They considered bringing their concerns directly to the War Master, but hesitated to question Horus's judgment without evidence of actual wrongdoing. The deployment decisions might simply reflect tactical considerations that the War Master had not fully explained to subordinate officers, and challenging those decisions could appear as lack of faith in their Primarch's strategic acumen. The assault began with orbital bombardments that targeted Istvan III's defensive installations and military concentrations, the fleet's weapons reducing fortifications to rubble and eliminating the rebel forces' ability to contest Imperial control of the skies. The bombardment followed standard compliance operation procedures, applying sufficient force to break organized resistance while avoiding the kind of indiscriminate destruction that would make subsequent reconstruction unnecessarily difficult. The rebel forces attempted to respond with their own orbital defenses, but their weapons proved inadequate against the fleet's shields and point defense systems. Within hours, Istvan III's military infrastructure had been effectively neutralized, leaving Pral's ground forces isolated and unable to coordinate effective resistance. The drop pods launched in waves that darkened Istvan III's skies, thousands of Astartes descending toward landing zones that intelligence had identified as optimal for establishing beachheads. The Sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters hit the surface simultaneously across multiple continents, their assault designed to prevent the rebels from concentrating their forces against any single landing site. The Space Marines encountered resistance that proved fiercer than intelligence reports had suggested, with Pral's forces fighting with determination that seemed to exceed what should be expected from recently rebellious civilians. The defenders employed tactics and equipment that indicated professional military training, their coordination suggesting experienced leadership rather than hastily organized militia. Loken led his company through the initial combat, the 10th advancing against defenders who contested every street and structure in the landing zone. The fighting was brutal but not exceptional by the standards of Space Marine operations, the rebels' determination insufficient to overcome the fundamental superiority of Astartes warriors in close combat. The captain maintained communication with other Sons of Horus units, coordinating the advance while ensuring that his company maintained proper formation and mutual support. The tactical situation developed as expected, with the Space Marines establishing secure perimeters and beginning the systematic elimination of organized resistance within their operational sectors. The bombardment that followed came without warning, weapons fire from the fleet striking the planet's surface with intensity that exceeded anything required for supporting ground operations. Loken's first indication of the attack was the screaming of proximity alarms as his armor sensors detected incoming ordnance on trajectories that would impact directly on Sons of Horus positions. The captain had seconds to process the impossibility of what his sensors reported before the first warheads detonated, releasing payloads that transformed the atmosphere itself into a weapon. The Life Eater virus spread from the impact points in expanding waves of molecular death, the biological agent consuming all organic matter it contacted and converting it into fuel for its own propagation. The virus killed with a thoroughness that defied conventional weapons, its effects visible as a gray-green mist that rolled across the landscape like fog. Everything the mist touched died instantly, flesh liquefying and bones dissolving as the virus broke down organic molecules into their component elements. The rebels died first, their unprotected bodies offering no resistance to the biological agent. The Space Marines' power armor provided temporary protection, sealed systems preventing immediate exposure, but the virus was designed to overcome such defenses through sheer persistence and the secondary effects of its propagation. As organic matter dissolved, it released gases that built pressure and temperature, the atmosphere itself beginning to burn as the virus consumed billions of tons of biomass across the planet's surface. Tarvitz had been coordinating Emperor's Children forces in a different sector when the bombardment began, his position giving him clear view of the fleet overhead and the weapon's fire descending toward the surface. The captain's tactical training allowed him to recognize immediately that the bombardment pattern was wrong, that the weapons were targeting Imperial forces rather than rebel positions. Tarvitz attempted to raise warnings through the command network, broadcasting alerts that the fleet was firing on its own troops, but his transmissions met with silence or dismissal from officers who seemed to expect the bombardment. The realization that this was deliberate rather than catastrophic error struck Tarvitz with physical force, the implications too terrible to fully process even as he began organizing his warriors for survival. The firestorm that followed the Life Eater's initial spread consumed what remained of Istvan III's atmosphere, the gases released by dissolving organic matter, igniting in a conflagration that raised surface temperatures to levels that would melt standard armor plate. The Space Marines caught in the open when the firestorm hit died instantly, their power armor's environmental systems overwhelmed by heat that exceeded any tolerance built into the equipment. Those who found shelter in structures with sufficient mass to provide thermal protection survived the initial firestorm, but found themselves trapped on a world where the atmosphere had been transformed into toxic vapor and the surface had been scoured of all life. The betrayal scale became apparent as the survivors conducted damage assessments and realized that thousands of their brothers had died in the bombardment, killed not by enemies, but by their own fleet. Garo had been aboard the Eisenstein when the bombardment began, the frigate's position in the fleet giving him direct observation of the weapons, fire targeting the surface. The battle captain watched in horror as the Life Eater virus was deployed against positions held by Death Guard warriors, the biological weapon consuming his brothers while officers around him observed the bombardment with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to grim determination. The realization that this had been planned, that the deployment patterns had been designed specifically to place certain warriors in position to be killed by their own fleet, struck Garo with the force of a physical blow. The battle captain's decades of service had not prepared him for betrayal on this scale, for the possibility that the War Master himself had ordered the murder of thousands of Space Marines, whose only crime was loyalty to the Emperor. The survivors on Istvan III's surface gathered in the ruins of what had been the Coral City, the planetary capital, where the densest concentration of structures had provided the best protection against the firestorm. Loken found Tarvitz and Torgeddon among the Emperor's children and sons of Horus warriors who had lived through the bombardment, the three captains immediately recognizing each other as kindred spirits who had been marked for death but had somehow survived. The Coral City's ruins held perhaps 10,000 Space Marines from the 4 legions, warriors who had been in positions that provided sufficient shelter when the Life Eater struck. They were scattered across multiple sectors, their communications degraded by the bombardment's electromagnetic effects, but they began organizing themselves into a defensive force as they realized that the betrayal would not end with the virus bombing. The fleet's augurs confirmed that significant numbers of Space Marines had survived the Life Eater deployment, their power armor's signatures still registering despite the biological weapon's effects. Horus received these reports with visible frustration, the War Master's plan having called for complete elimination of the loyalist elements within the 4 legions through the virus bombing alone. The survivors' continued existence required a modification to the strategy, necessitating ground operations to finish what the Life Eater had begun. The War Master issued orders for the traitor elements of the Sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters to deploy to the surface, their mission to hunt down and eliminate the loyalists who had escaped the bombardment. The forces descending to complete the purge numbered in the tens of thousands, warriors who had embraced Horus's rebellion and now prepared to kill brothers who remained faithful to the Emperor. The betrayed loyalists fortified their positions in the Coral City's ruins, using rubble and destroyed structures to create defensive works that would force the traitors to fight for every meter of ground. Loken, Tarvitz, and Torgeddon established a command structure that coordinated the scattered survivors into a coherent defensive force, their leadership providing organization to warriors who had been scattered by the bombardment and were struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal they had experienced. The Loyalists knew they could not win, that they were outnumbered and cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or escape. Their only option was to make the traitors pay for every Loyalist life in blood and time, to survive long enough that word of the betrayal might reach Terra and warn the Emperor of what Horus had become. The defense of the Coral City stretched across weeks that felt like years to the Loyalists trapped within its ruins. Every day brought fresh assaults from traitor forces who possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and the support of orbital assets that the defenders could not match. Loken coordinated defensive positions from a command post established in what had been a municipal administration building, its reinforced structure providing protection against all but direct artillery strikes. The captain worked alongside Tarvitz and Torgeddon to maximize the effectiveness of their limited forces, positioning warriors where they could inflict maximum casualties on attackers while preserving their own strength for as long as possible. The Loyalists knew they were dying slowly, ground down by attrition they could not reverse, but they fought with determination born from the knowledge that every hour they survived was another hour that might allow word of the betrayal to reach Terra. The traitor forces approached the systematic elimination of their former brothers with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The World Eaters attacked with the mindless fury that the Butcher's nails drove them toward, their assaults lacking coordination, but compensating through sheer aggression and willingness to absorb casualties that would break other forces. The Death Guard prosecuted their operations with methodical efficiency, their siege warfare expertise allowing them to reduce Loyalist strongpoints through calculated application of firepower and maneuver. The Emperor's children fought with precision that bordered on artistic, each assault carefully planned to exploit weaknesses in the defenders' positions. The Sons of Horus combined all these approaches, their tactical flexibility allowing them to adapt to whatever resistance the Loyalists offered. Garo had commandeered the Eisenstein through a combination of personal authority and the support of warriors who shared his horror at what had occurred on Istvan III's surface. The battle captain's actions constituted mutiny by any standard definition, but the magnitude of Horus's betrayal rendered normal considerations of military discipline meaningless. Garo gathered those Death Guard who had not embraced the Lodge's corruption, warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor remained absolute despite their Primarch's treachery. The frigate's escape from the fleet required fighting through ships that attempted to prevent their departure, the Eisenstein sustaining damage that nearly crippled the vessel before it could translate into the warp. Garo set course for Terra, carrying with him the first concrete evidence of the War Master's rebellion and the desperate hope that warning the Emperor might prevent the catastrophe from consuming the entire Imperium. The journey through the warp tested the Eisenstein's crew beyond anything they had experienced during decades of service. The ship's Geller fields, damaged during the escape from Istvan, failed to provide complete protection against the Imperium's denizens. Entities that dwelled in the warp recognized the frigate as carrying souls who had rejected Chaos's corruption, making the vessel a target for attacks that manifested as both physical breaches and psychic assaults against the crew's sanity. Garo and his warriors fought running battles through the Eisenstein's corridors against things that should not exist in real space, their bolters and chainswords proving barely adequate against enemies whose forms shifted and reformed with each wound inflicted. The navigator struggled to maintain course, while the warp itself seemed determined to prevent the frigate from reaching Terra, currents and eddies in the Imperium pushing the ship off trajectory despite all efforts to correct their heading. The Emperor received word of Istvan III through multiple channels that arrived nearly simultaneously, each source confirming what the others reported with consistency that eliminated any possibility of mistake or exaggeration. Garo's testimony provided detailed first-hand accounts of the betrayal, the battle captain's record of service lending credibility to claims that would otherwise have seemed too terrible to believe. Astropathic communications from other sources corroborated the essential facts, describing how Horus had deployed virus weapons against his own forces, and then sent traitor elements to eliminate survivors. The Master of Mankind's response to these reports was immediate and decisive, his strategic acumen recognizing that the War Master's betrayal represented an existential threat to everything the Imperium had built over 2 centuries of warfare and consolidation. The Emperor commanded that 7 legions deploy to Istvan V to bring the traitor War Master to justice and end the rebellion before it could spread beyond the system. The Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus received orders to lead the assault, the 10th Legion's Primarch responding with fury that matched the magnitude of Horus's crime. Ferrus had maintained a close friendship with Fulgrim since the Great Crusade's early years, the 2 Primarchs having forged bonds through shared campaigns and mutual respect for each other's capabilities. The news that Fulgrim had joined Horus's rebellion struck Ferrus as personal betrayal, the Iron Hands Primarch taking the Emperor's orders as both military necessity and opportunity to confront a brother who had abandoned everything they had once shared. The Salamanders and Raven Guard joined the Iron Hands as the First Wave's primary assault force, their Primarchs Vulcan and Corax bringing legions whose capabilities complemented Ferrus's direct approach to warfare. Vulcan led warriors who specialized in close-quarters combat and the kind of brutal grinding warfare that would be required to dig entrenched traitors out of fortified positions. Corax commanded specialists in infiltration and precision strikes, the Raven Guard's doctrine emphasizing speed and surgical elimination of key targets. The 3 legions together represented a combined force of nearly 100,000 Space Marines, supported by extensive Imperial Army contingents and the full logistics infrastructure required to sustain major military operations. The deployment represented one of the largest concentrations of Loyalist strength assembled since the Great Crusade's peak, a demonstration that the Emperor would commit whatever resources necessary to crush the rebellion. 4 additional legions received orders to form the second wave, their role to reinforce the initial assault and provide the overwhelming force necessary to guarantee victory. The Iron Warriors under Perdurabo would bring their expertise in siege warfare, their capabilities essential for reducing any fortifications the traitors might construct. The Night Lords commanded by Conrad Kurz would contribute their particular talents for terror tactics and rapid strike operations. The Word Bearers under Lorger would add their numbers to the assault, the 17th Legion's size making them valuable despite questions about their combat effectiveness. The Alpha Legion led by Alfarius would provide intelligence capabilities and unconventional warfare expertise that could exploit opportunities the main assault created. The second wave's deployment would occur after the first wave had established beachheads, their arrival timed to deliver the decisive blow that would shatter whatever resistance the traitors organized. The strategic planning for the Istvan V operation reflected the Emperor's recognition that Horus remained a military genius whose capabilities had not been diminished by his treachery. The War Master would not simply wait for Imperial forces to arrive and destroy him. He would prepare defenses that exploited Istvan V's terrain and would position his forces to maximize their effectiveness against attackers who possessed numerical superiority. The Loyalist battle plan accounted for these factors by concentrating overwhelming force at the operation's beginning, hitting the traitors with 3 full legions before they could complete their defensive preparations. The second wave's role was to prevent any possibility of traitor reinforcement or escape, creating a containment that would allow the first wave to methodically eliminate all hostile forces. Ferrus Manus chafed at the delay required to coordinate 7 legions' deployment, his fury at Fulgrim's betrayal driving him toward immediate action rather than careful preparation. The Iron Hands Primarch argued for launching the assault as soon as the first wave could be assembled, accepting greater risk in exchange for speed that would prevent the traitors from strengthening their positions. Vulcan and Corax counseled patience, recognizing that hasty attacks against an enemy commanded by Horus invited disaster regardless of numerical advantages. The debate among the three Primarchs reflected tensions between the desire for swift justice and the military necessity of proper preparation, each perspective valid but incompatible with the others. The final decision came from Terra itself, the Emperor ordering the assault to proceed once the first wave reached full strength, but before the second wave completed its own deployment. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard translated into the Istvan system to find the Traitor Legions had fortified positions across Istvan V's surface. The planet's geography favored defenders, with mountain ranges and volcanic regions creating natural choke points that would force attackers to advance through killing zones where the traitors could concentrate their firepower. Horus had positioned the Sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters to maximize these advantages, their deployment reflecting the War Master's intimate knowledge of how to conduct defensive operations against numerically superior forces. Orbital reconnaissance revealed extensive fortification construction, with trenches and bunker complexes covering approaches to the traitors' primary positions in a region called the Urgal Depression. The Urgal Depression was a vast basin surrounded by ridges that provided commanding views of the approaches from every direction. The black volcanic sand that covered the depression's floor offered no cover for advancing forces, creating an open killing ground where defenders on the ridges could engage attackers from positions of absolute advantage. The traitors had reinforced these natural defenses with manufactured fortifications, their work showing the professional competence expected from Space Marines who had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of warfare. Gun emplacements covered every approach vector, their fields of fire overlapping to eliminate dead zones where attackers might find shelter. Trench networks connected defensive positions, allowing the traitors to shift forces rapidly to counter any breakthrough attempts. The fortifications represented exactly the kind of defensive work that would maximize casualties among attacking forces while preserving the defender's strength. Ferrus insisted on leading the assault personally despite the obvious dangers of committing a Primarch to the initial wave. The Iron Hands Primarch argued that his presence would inspire the Loyalist forces and demonstrate that the Emperor's sons would not hide behind their warriors when confronting treachery. Vulcan and Corax recognized the validity of this argument, even as they understood the risks of losing a Primarch during the operation's opening phases. The 3 commanders coordinated their assault plan, dividing the Loyalist forces to attack the Urgal Depression from multiple directions simultaneously. The Iron Hands would strike at the Depression's center, their assault designed to draw traitor attention and fix their forces in position. The Salamanders would attack from the western approach, their close combat specialists positioned to exploit any gaps the Iron Hands assault created. The Raven Guard would infiltrate through the eastern ridges, their mission to eliminate artillery positions and command nodes that coordinated the traitors' defense. The drop pod assault began with thousands of Loyalists descending toward Istvan V's surface, their approach contested by anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with explosions and shrapnel. The traitors had prepared for exactly this kind of assault, their defensive positions incorporating weapons specifically designed to engage drop pods during their vulnerable descent phase. Dozens of pods were destroyed before reaching the surface, their contents killed instantly as the armored shells were torn apart by sustained fire. The survivors hit the ground in the Urgal Depression's killing zones, immediately engaging traitor forces from positions that offered minimal cover against the concentrated firepower pouring down from the ridges. The battle that followed demonstrated why Space Marine against Space Marine combat represented the most brutal form of warfare the galaxy had ever witnessed. Both sides possessed identical training, equivalent equipment, and the enhanced physiology that made Astartes warriors capable of feats impossible for normal humans. The advantages that Space Marines enjoyed when fighting conventional enemies disappeared when both sides consisted of superhuman warriors, reducing the conflict to grinding attrition, where victory went to whoever could sustain losses longer. The Loyalists advanced across the black sand under fire that would have annihilated any other force within minutes, their power armor-absorbing punishment that killed those warriors unlucky enough to take hits in weak points or from weapons powerful enough to penetrate ceramite plate. Horus led the Iron Hands assault with the absolute commitment that characterized everything the 10th Primarch did, his silvered hands crushing traitor skulls and tearing through armor as he carved a path toward the ridge where intelligence suggested Fulgrim had established his command position. The Iron Hands Primarch fought with fury that transcended tactical calculation, his desire to confront Fulgrim personally overriding the careful approach that normally governed his combat decisions. The warriors following Horus matched their Primarch's intensity, the Iron Hands pushing forward despite casualties that would have forced other forces to halt and consolidate. The 10th Legion's advance created a salient that penetrated deep into the traitor positions, their momentum carrying them up the slopes toward the ridgeline despite concentrated fire from multiple directions. The Salamanders ground forward through their own sector, Vulcan's massive form visible at the front of the assault as he wielded weapons that few others could carry. The 18th Legion specialized in the kind of close-quarters brutality that characterized fighting in the Urgal Depression's confines, their flamers and meltaguns proving devastatingly effective against traitors who attempted to hold fortified positions. The Salamanders absorbed horrific casualties during their advance, but maintained cohesion through their Primarch's leadership and the bonds of brotherhood that define the Legion's culture. Vulcan's warriors fought with determination born from absolute conviction in their cause, each salamander willing to die if his death contributed to bringing the traitors to justice. The Raven Guard executed their infiltration with the precision that made them the Imperium's premier specialists in covert operations, Korax leading elements of his legion through approaches that the traitors had dismissed as too difficult for large-scale assault. The 19th Legion moved through broken terrain with speed that conventional forces could not match, their advance bringing them into position to strike at traitor artillery emplacements and command bunkers from unexpected directions. The Raven Guard's attacks disrupted the traitors' defensive coordination, forcing them to divert forces to counter threats that appeared and disappeared with frustrating unpredictability. Korax personally led strikes that eliminated key officers and destroyed weapons that had been inflicting heavy casualties on the Iron Hands and Salamanders, the Raven Guard Primarch's combat prowess allowing him to accomplish objectives that would have required entire companies of conventional troops. The Loyalist assault achieved its objectives despite the terrible cost in lives and materiel. The Iron Hands reached the ridgeline, their advance forcing the traitors to commit reserves to prevent complete collapse of their defensive line. The Salamanders secured positions on the western approaches, their presence threatening to envelope the traitors' flank if they could not be dislodged. The Raven Guard's infiltration had degraded the traitors' ability to coordinate their defense, creating gaps in their coverage that the main assault forces exploited ruthlessly. After hours of sustained combat that left thousands dead on both sides, the Loyalists had established footholds that would allow them to bring their full strength to bear against the traitor positions. Victory seemed within reach, the first wave having accomplished what the strategic planning had projected despite the fierce resistance. The second wave's arrival should have delivered the decisive blow that shattered the traitors' defense and allowed the Loyalists to complete their mission. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion translated into the Istvan system and began their descent toward the surface, their drop pods and Thunderhawks filling the sky as they moved to reinforce the first wave's assault. The Loyalists on the ground observed the second wave's approach with relief, recognizing that the additional forces would allow them to press their advantage and overwhelm the traitors through sheer weight of numbers. Horus had reached a position where he could see Fulgrim's command post, the Iron Hands Primarch, preparing for the confrontation he had anticipated since learning of his brother's betrayal. The second wave opened fire on the Loyalists from behind, their weapons targeting the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard warriors who had been fighting for hours to establish their positions. The betrayal was total and coordinated, executed with precision that demonstrated extensive planning and preparation. The Iron Warriors' heavy weapons tore through Loyalist formations from positions that should have been providing covering fire. The Night Lords struck at command elements and communication nodes, their attacks designed to create maximum confusion and prevent organized response. The Word-Bearers deployed across a broad front, their numbers allowing them to engage Loyalist forces across multiple sectors simultaneously. The Alpha Legion conducted operations that severed the first wave's supply lines and eliminated any possibility of retreat to their landing zones. The Loyalists found themselves trapped between the traitor forces they had been assaulting and the second wave that had revealed its true allegiance through devastating opening volleys. Warriors who had been advancing moments earlier now fought desperately to survive, their formations shattered by attacks from directions they had believed were secure. The careful coordination that had characterized the first wave's assault dissolved into chaos as companies and squads found themselves isolated and surrounded, cut off from their command structure, and unable to coordinate with other Loyalist elements. The black sand of the Urgal Depression became a killing ground where 3 Loyalist legions died in numbers that defied comprehension, their warriors selling their lives as dearly as possible, but unable to overcome the fundamental tactical impossibility of their situation. Ferrus Manus fought his way toward Fulgrim's position even as the massacre unfolded around him, the Iron Hands Primarch's fury driving him forward despite the obvious futility of continuing the assault. The 10th Primarch had lost the capacity for tactical calculation, his need to confront Fulgrim personally overriding every other consideration, including his own survival. The Iron Hands who followed their Primarch died in waves as they attempted to protect Ferrus from the concentrated fire that the traitors directed at the most visible target on the battlefield. The 10th Legion's casualties mounted with horrifying speed, entire companies annihilated as they tried to maintain formation around their Primarch while under attack from multiple directions. The confrontation between Ferrus and Fulgrim occurred on a ridge overlooking the Urgal Depression, the 2 Primarchs meeting in single combat while their legions died around them. The duel was brief and brutal, Fulgrim wielding a blade that carried warp contamination similar to the anatheme that had wounded Horus. The Emperor's Children Primarch moved with speed and precision that exceeded anything Ferrus had witnessed during their previous sparring matches, Fulgrim's combat capabilities enhanced by gifts from the Chaos Gods he now served. The Iron Hands Primarch fought with the mechanical efficiency that characterized everything he did, but rage had compromised his normally flawless technique. Fulgrim exploited every opening, his blade finding gaps in Ferrus's defense until the final strike that removed the Iron Hands Primarch's head from his shoulders. Ferrus Manus's death sent shockwaves through the Loyalist forces that exceeded the purely military impact of losing a Primarch. The 10th Legion had followed their commander into the Urgal Depression with absolute faith in his judgment and capabilities, their willingness to sustain terrible casualties rooted in conviction that Ferrus would lead them to victory. The Primarch's fall shattered that faith, the Iron Hands' cohesion collapsing as warriors who had maintained discipline despite impossible circumstances finally broke under the combined weight of their losses and their leader's death. The 10th Legion's survivors attempted to fight their way clear of the trap, but organized resistance had become impossible. The Iron Hands died in scattered groups, their last stands achieving nothing except adding to the count of Loyalist dead. Vulcan recognized that the first wave had been destroyed as an effective fighting force, the Salamander's Primarch's tactical assessment cutting through the chaos to identify the only option that offered any possibility of survival for his remaining warriors. The 18th Legion could not win, could not hold their positions, could not accomplish any military objective that would justify additional casualties. Vulcan ordered a fighting withdrawal, his command authority imposing enough organization on the shattered Salamanders to allow some elements to disengage and attempt escape. The Primarch personally led the rearguard action that covered the withdrawal, his massive form and devastating firepower buying time for his sons to reach their landing zones. Thousands of Salamanders died during the retreat, but Vulcan's leadership saved some portion of his legion from complete annihilation. Corax executed a similar withdrawal with the Raven Guard, the 19th Legion's expertise in rapid maneuver, allowing them to break contact more effectively than the Salamander's heavier formations could manage. The Raven Guard Primarch had recognized the second wave's betrayal in the opening moments, his paranoid nature and tactical acumen combining to provide the seconds of warning that made the difference between total destruction and catastrophic losses. Corax gathered what remained of his legion and led them through routes that the traitors had not fully secured, the Raven Guard's infiltration skills allowing them to evade pursuit that would have caught slower forces. The 19th Legion suffered terrible casualties during their escape, but Corax preserved enough of his warriors to maintain the Legion as a functioning military force. The Dropsite Massacre, as the betrayal at Istvan V became known, claimed approximately 100,000 Loyalist Space Marines killed or captured. The Iron Hands had been effectively destroyed as a legion, their survivors numbering in the hundreds rather than thousands. The Salamanders and Raven Guard had been crippled, their strength reduced to fractions of what they had possessed before the battle. The Traitor Legions had revealed their full allegiance, 8 legions now openly serving Horus's rebellion against the Emperor. The strategic situation had transformed from a rebellion that might be swiftly crushed into a civil war that would consume the entire galaxy. The Imperium's military strength, divided between loyalist and traitor factions, whose combined power had previously been employed in humanity's service. The news of the massacre reached Terra through the same channels that had brought word of Istvan III's betrayal, each report confirming the catastrophic scope of the disaster. The Emperor recognized immediately that the heresy could no longer be contained through military action alone, that Horus had successfully created conditions for a conflict that would determine whether the Imperium survived or collapsed into the anarchy that had characterized Old Night. The Master of Mankind began preparations for the siege he knew would eventually come to Terra itself, his attention shifting from the Webway project to the survival of humanity as a whole. The Webway project, the hidden purpose behind his withdrawal from the Crusade, was now a secondary concern beside the imminent need to marshal every remaining loyalist force for the defense of the throne world. The Emperor ordered Rogel Dorn to fortify Terra and recalled all loyal elements of the Imperial Fists to garrison the Imperial Palace. Malcador the Sigillite activated contingencies long prepared but never intended for use, including the elevation of new inquisitorial authorities and the mobilization of Titan legions, custodians, and Terran defense cohorts. Across the Imperium, loyalist forces received fragmented, desperate astropathic warnings of the scale of Horus's revolt. Some legions, such as the Ultramarines under Rotbute Gilliman, were too far away to intervene immediately, while others found themselves surrounded by traitor elements or cut off by the War Master's fleet movements. The Imperium entered a state of strategic paralysis as communication lines collapsed under warp storms and psychic interference deliberately engineered by the traitor forces. On Istvan V, the traitors began the grim work of consolidating their victory. The dead were harvested for gene seed where useful, loyalist wounded were executed, and shattered wargear was left to rust on the black sands. Horus allowed limited pursuit of the fleeing Salamanders and Raven Guard, but he recognized that annihilating them completely was unnecessary. In his calculus, the psychological and strategic devastation wrought at Istvan V achieved his goals more effectively than erasing every survivor. For the Loyalists, the events at Istvan V marked a point of no return. The Imperium was now fully committed to a war not against Xeno's empires or recalcitrant human worlds, but against its own best warriors, its own sons. Vulcan and Corax, carrying the weight of failure and the trauma of betrayal, began the long withdrawal that would scatter their survivors across the stars, each Primarch forced to confront the near destruction of his legion. Ferrus Manus's death sent shockwaves through the Loyalist command structure, his loss a grim reminder that even the Emperor's demigod sons could fall. The Dropsite Massacre became the fulcrum upon which the entire galaxy turned. The War Master now commanded half the Space Marine legions, vast swathes of the Imperial Army, and multiple Titan legions. His march toward Terra had begun, not merely as a campaign of conquest, but as a war for the soul and future of humanity. The Emperor's remaining loyalists prepared themselves for a conflict that would eclipse all wars before or since. And so the seeds of treachery planted years earlier, at Ulanor, at Nicaea, at the Interrex, and on Davin, came to full fruition. The Horus heresy had begun in earnest, and the galaxy braced for the firestorm that would follow.